I stood alone at the altar in my $3,000 wedding dress, staring at 3 completely empty rows where my family should have been sitting. 47 guests on my husband's side, 4 on mine. I tried to smile through my vows, but halfway through saying, I noticed my phone lighting up on the gift table. 25 missed calls, all from Mum. My hand shook as I opened her final text. Come home. Now. Emergency. I thought someone had died. I drove there in my wedding dress mascara running heart-pounding, thinking the worst. But when I opened the backyard gate, my mother was flipping burgers. My father was laughing with neighbours. My brother was celebrating his new job with a cake that read congratulations. There was no emergency. They had thrown a barbecue instead of coming to my wedding. My mother looked at me standing there in my mud-stained dress and said 5 words that destroyed me. I wanted to see if you'd come. That was the day I realised my family had been testing me my entire life. And that was the day I decided to stop playing their game. This is the story of how I exposed them all and finally set myself free. My name is Michelle Carter. I'm 32 years old, and by most measures, I've built a life I should be proud of. I'm a sales manager at a major software company in Columbus, pulling in 6 figures and closing deals most people only dream about. But every Sunday, I drive 2 hours back to the small Ohio town where I grew up carrying homemade food and hope that maybe this time will be different. This particular Sunday, I'd been up since 5 in the morning making lasagna from scratch. The same recipe my grandmother taught me before she passed. 3 types of cheese, homemade sauce simmering for hours, fresh pasta sheets rolled out by hand. I packed it carefully in my car, still warm, wrapped in towels, like a precious cargo. The whole drive, I imagined my mother's face when she tasted it. Maybe she'd smile. Maybe she'd finally say she was proud of me. I pulled up to my parents' modest ranch house just as my brother Ethan was getting out of his BMW. Well, technically, it was my parents' old BMW. They'd given it to him after his second layoff, said he needed reliable transportation for job hunting. That was 18 months ago. I'd bought my Honda Civic with my own money right out of college. Ethan walked up the driveway, empty-handed hands in his pockets, that easy smile on his face. I wrestled the heavy lasagna dish out of my back seat, feeling the heat through the towels. "Hey, sis," he called out, not offering to help. Before I could respond, the front door flew open. My mother practically ran down the steps, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Ethan, my boy is home." She wrapped him in a hug that lasted a full 10 seconds, rocking him back and forth like he'd returned from war instead of the apartment 3 miles away that my parents paid for. When she finally released him, she glanced at me. "Oh, Michelle, you're here too. Put that in the kitchen, would you?" I carried the lasagna inside, my arms aching. In the kitchen, I found a store-bought container of pre-mixed salad on the counter. The price sticker was still on it, $9.99. During dinner, my mother couldn't stop raving about it. "Ethan, this salad is delicious. You always know exactly what I like." She took another bite, closing her eyes like she was tasting something divine. "Michelle, you should learn from your brother. Simple is better. This lasagna is a bit heavy." I'd spent 5 hours on that lasagna. Ethan had spent 3 minutes in a grocery store. After we ate, I helped my mother with the dishes, while Ethan settled into the living room with my father to watch football. I could hear their voices, my father's warm and engaged in a way it never was with me. I scrubbed a baking dish and tried to work up the courage to bring up my news. "Mum," I said carefully, "I signed a $2 million contract this week. It's the biggest deal our division has ever closed." She didn't look up from the pot she was drying. "That's nice, dear. Just don't work too much. Daniel won't like it if you're never home. Men need their wives present, you know." In the living room, I heard my father's voice. "So, Ethan, any job prospects looking promising?" His tone was hopeful, encouraging. Like Ethan was a prize student who'd just had a temporary setback, rather than a 28-year-old man who'd been fired 3 times in 2 years. Then I heard him ask me, "Michelle, you still working at that computer place?" That computer place. I was a sales manager at a Fortune 500 company. I'd been there for 8 years. I'd been promoted 4 times. "Yes, Dad," I called back. "Still there." I was drying my hands when my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel, my fiancé. Did they ask about the wedding? I looked down at the screen, then up through the kitchen window. Outside, Ethan was leaving and my mother was hugging him goodbye like he was departing for deployment. I watched my father slip an envelope into Ethan's jacket pocket. I knew without asking it was money. It was always money. Neither of them said goodbye to me. I was heading to my car when I heard my mother's voice drifting through the open kitchen window. She was on the phone with someone laughing. "Oh, I don't know about Michelle's wedding. It's the same weekend as Ethan's birthday. We should just have a barbecue that weekend instead. Something low-key. Family only." I stood there, frozen car keys cutting into my palm. Family only. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for 10 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. Family only. The words kept echoing in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. When I finally drove away, I didn't remember the route home. 2 hours later, I walked through my front door and Daniel took one look at my face and knew. "They didn't ask about the wedding, did they?" he said quietly. I shook my head. I couldn't find the words yet. Instead, I went to our bedroom and opened the closet, reaching up to the top shelf where I kept a box of things from my childhood. Old report cards, ribbons from school competitions, a few photographs, and, underneath it all, a diary with a faded purple cover. Daniel followed me sitting on the edge of the bed as I flipped through pages I hadn't looked at in years. But before I could find what I was searching for, another memory hit me so hard I had to sit down. Christmas 5 years ago. I'd just received my year-end bonus, the biggest check I'd ever earned. $15,000 for exceeding my sales targets by 40%. I was so proud, and I'd wanted to share that joy with my parents to show them what their daughter had accomplished. I'd spent hours shopping. For my father, a Seiko watch he'd admired once in a store window 2 years earlier. He'd stopped to look at it, touched the glass, then walked away, saying it was too expensive for a retired factory worker. It cost me $800. For my mother, a delicate silver necklace with a small sapphire pendant. Her birthstone. Another $600. I'd wrapped them carefully, written heartfelt cards about how much they meant to me, how grateful I was for everything they'd given me growing up. Ethan had shown up on Christmas morning with a $10 box of chocolates from the drugstore, the kind they sell at the checkout counter. The price tag was still on it. My mother opened my gift first. She held up the necklace, and for one brief, shining moment, I thought I saw pleasure in her eyes. Then her expression shifted. "Michelle, this is too much, too extravagant. You shouldn't spend money like this. It's wasteful." She set it aside like it had disappointed her. Then she opened Ethan's chocolates. Her whole face transformed. "Oh, Ethan, these are my favourites. You always know exactly what your mother likes. You're so thoughtful." She actually teared up. Over $10 drugstore chocolates. My father's reaction was similar. He looked at the Seiko, frowned and said, "You shouldn't have spent this much. What will people think that we raised a daughter who shows off?" But when Ethan gave him a $50 gift card to Home Depot, my father hugged him and said it was the most practical gift he'd ever received. I went home that night and cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could go inside my apartment. 3 weeks later, I was searching for a recipe online and accidentally opened my mother's eBay account on her iPad that she'd left at my place. And there it was, my silver necklace, listed for $200. The description read, "Beautiful silver necklace with sapphire never worn, perfect condition." In the message history, I found her conversation with the buyer. The money had gone directly to paying off Ethan's credit card debt. $1,500 he'd racked up buying things he couldn't afford. She'd sold my gift to bail out my brother, and she'd never told me. Jesus, Daniel whispered. He'd moved closer, reading over my shoulder at the diary in my hands. I'd forgotten I was holding it. How long has this been going on? Forever, I heard myself say. Then I started flipping through the pages, looking for the entries I remembered writing. Age 10. My handwriting was rounder, then more careful. I won the county art competition today. Mrs. Henderson said my painting was the best she'd seen in 15 years of teaching. She hung it in the main hallway. I was so excited to tell Mum. But when I got home, she said I shouldn't show off because it would make Ethan feel bad. She made me take the ribbon off my backpack. She said pride comes before a fall. I don't understand. Isn't she proud of me? I remembered that day so clearly. I'd painted a landscape of our backyard in autumn, all gold and red leaves, the old oak tree my grandfather had planted. I'd worked on it for 3 weeks, staying after school in the art room. When they called my name at the assembly, I'd felt like I was floating. My mother hadn't come to the assembly. She'd said she had to stay home with Ethan because he had a cold. Daniel's hand found mine. Keep reading, he said softly. Age 14. Ethan got expelled today. He was caught cheating on his final exams. Dad called me into his office and said it was my fault. He said I should have been helping Ethan study instead of spending so much time on my own schoolwork. He said a good sister would have made sure her brother succeeded. I tried to tell him that Ethan never asked for help, that he always said he didn't need it. But Dad said I should have known better. I should have insisted. Now, Ethan has to go to a different school and everyone is upset with me. I don't know what I did wrong. I had all A's this semester. Nobody said congratulations. I'd forgotten about that. Or maybe I'd buried it. But seeing the words in my teenage handwriting brought it all rushing back. The way my father had looked at me like I'd personally destroyed Ethan's future. The way my mother had been cold to me for weeks afterward, barely speaking at dinner. I flipped forward, looking for one more entry. And there it was. Age 16. Maybe if I disappear, they'll finally miss me. But I'm too scared to find out they won't. Sometimes I imagine just leaving and never coming back. Going somewhere far away where nobody knows me. Where I could be anyone. Where I wouldn't have to watch Mum hug Ethan like he's the most precious thing in the world while she barely looks at me. Where I wouldn't have to hear Dad's voice get warm and soft when he talks to Ethan, then flat and distant when he talks to me. But I'm afraid. What if I left and they didn't even notice? What if I called and they didn't answer? What if I came back and they'd moved on like I'd never existed at all? At least now I know where I stand. At least now I'm close enough to keep trying. Maybe someday I'll be good enough. Maybe someday they'll love me too. Daniel's eyes were wet when he looked up from the page. Michelle, he started, but I shook my head. There's one more thing, I said. I closed the diary and looked at him. When I was 10 years old, right after I won that art competition, I asked my father a question. We were sitting on the back porch, and he was in a good mood. I don't remember why, but I asked him, Daddy, when I get married someday, will you walk me down the aisle? I could see it so clearly. The way he'd smiled, the way he'd reached over and ruffled my hair. The gentleness in his voice when he answered. He said, Of course, princess. That was the only time in my entire life he ever called me that. Princess. Just that once. And I held on to that word for 22 years. I looked down at my engagement ring, then back up at Daniel. That's all I want. I don't need the expensive wedding. I don't need all the guests or the fancy reception. I just want my father to keep that one promise he made to a 10-year-old girl who thought she was his princess. Just that one day. Just that one walk down the aisle. Daniel pulled me close, and I felt his heart beating against my cheek. He'll be there, he said, but his voice was uncertain. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew the truth. But knowing something and accepting it are two different things. So when Daniel suggested we host an engagement party, I convinced myself this would be different. This was official. This was important. This was their chance to show up for me. I booked a private room at Marcello's, the nicest Italian restaurant in Columbus. Not the most expensive place in the city, but nice enough to feel special. The kind of place with real cloth napkins and a pianist playing softly in the corner. I sent out invitations 6 weeks in advance, beautiful cream-coloured cards with our names embossed in gold. I made sure my parents got theirs first, hand-delivered it to their house on a Sunday afternoon. My mother had held the invitation, running her finger over the raised lettering. Very fancy, she'd said, and I couldn't tell if it was approval or criticism. We'll be there. My father had nodded from his armchair. Wouldn't miss it. Ethan had been there too, had taken his invitation and tucked it into his jacket pocket without really looking at it. Yeah, sure, I'll come. I'd spent $2,000 on that party. The room, rental, the appetizers, the open bar, the cake. Daniel had offered to split the cost, but I'd insisted on paying. I wanted to do this. I wanted to show my parents that I could host something beautiful, something worthy of celebration. The RSVPs came back steadily. Daniel's parents, of course, his 2 sisters and their families, my colleagues from work, my college roommate who was flying in from Boston, cousins I hadn't seen in years. Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, sent back her card with a note that said she was so happy for me. 40 people total, including my parents and Ethan, who'd all checked, yes, we'll attend. The party was scheduled for 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening. Daniel and I arrived at 5:30 to make sure everything was perfect. The room looked beautiful. String lights twinkled. Overhead, white roses cascaded from tall vases on each table, and our engagement photos were displayed on a table near the entrance. By 6:37, people had arrived. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Daniel's family surrounded us with warmth, his mother hugging me tight and whispering how lucky they were to have me joining their family. But 3 seats at the family table remained empty. The place cards read Mr. and Mrs. Carter and Ethan Carter. 6:30. I checked my phone for the 15th time. No messages, no missed calls. They're probably just running late, I said to Daniel's mother when she gave me a concerned look. You know how traffic can be. 6:45. I called my mother's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried my father's number. Same thing. I sent a text to Ethan. Everything okay? We're waiting for you guys. 7 o'clock. People were starting to notice. I could see them glancing at the empty seats, then at me, then away quickly. The conversation seemed to grow louder, as if everyone was trying to fill the awkward silence. Daniel squeezed my hand. Maybe we should just start, he said gently. But I couldn't move toward the microphone. Couldn't stand up in front of everyone and pretend those empty seats weren't there. At 7:15, Aunt Ruth burst through the door, her face flushed and her hair windblown, like she'd been running. She rushed straight to me, pulling me aside into a quiet corner near the coat check. Honey, I'm so sorry I'm late, she said, breathless. I went to your parents' house first, thinking maybe we could all drive together. Something in her voice made my stomach drop. And she took both of my hands in hers. Her fingers were cold. Michelle, I'm so sorry. Ethan had some friends over. They were having a barbecue in the backyard. Your parents were there with him. When I asked about the party, your mother said they decided to stay home, that Ethan needed them today. The restaurant suddenly felt too hot, too bright, too loud. Did she say anything else? Aunt Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She said you'd understand, that you always understood. I stood there still holding Aunt Ruth's cold hands and felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, just crack. Okay, I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, distant. Okay. I walked back into the party room on legs that didn't feel like my own. Daniel saw my face and started toward me, but I held up a hand. Not yet. I couldn't fall apart yet. I picked up the microphone. My hand was shaking so badly, I had to grip it with both hands. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," I said. "It means the world to Daniel and me that you're here to celebrate with us. Everyone who matters is here. Everyone who chose to show up, chose to be part of our lives. Thank you for choosing us." I saw Daniel's mother press a napkin to her eyes, saw my college roommate reach for her husband's hand, saw understanding dawn on face after face. We cut the cake, people made toasts, I smiled and laughed at the right moments. I hugged guests as they left and thanked them for coming. I played the part of the happy bride-to-be perfectly. And then everyone was gone except Daniel and the restaurant staff cleaning up. I excused myself to the bathroom, walked into the furthest stall, locked the door and slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold tile floor in my beautiful blue dress. That's where Daniel found me, 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the bathroom floor beside me in his good suit and pulled me against his chest while I sobbed into his shirt. "We're building our own family now," he said quietly, stroking my hair. I wanted to believe him, but all I could think about were those 3 empty seats and my mother's words, "You'd understand. You always understood." The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a headache. My phone was ringing. I grabbed it from the nightstand, saw Dad on the screen, and felt a surge of hope so intense it hurt. He was calling to apologise. He was calling to explain. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad, Michelle." His voice was brisk, businesslike. "Your brother needs $3,000 for rent. He's behind 2 months and they're threatening eviction. Can you wire it today? Family helps family." I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, unable to form words. "Michelle, are you there? Did you hear me?" I ended the call without answering. 2 minutes later, a text came through from Aunt Ruth. "There's something about your mother you should know. She made the same choice once. Ask me about 1995. I stared at those words for a long time, but I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to know. Not yet. The wedding was only 2 weeks away, and I needed to get through it first. I needed to believe just for a little while longer that maybe things could still be different. Then 3 days later, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. Her name on my phone screen made my stomach clench. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Michelle, honey." Her voice was soft, gentle in a way I hadn't heard in years. Maybe ever. "I've been thinking about the engagement party, about everything. And I want you to know that I bought a dress for your wedding." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. "It's blue," she continued. "That beautiful cornflower blue you always loved as a little girl. Remember, you had that dress when you were 7, wore it until it didn't fit anymore. I saw this one in the store window, and I thought of you. I want to be there, Michelle. I want to see you get married." Something broke open inside me. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. "Mom," I whispered. "I know I haven't always been the mother you needed," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "But I'm trying. I want to try. This is your day, your special day, and I want to be part of it." After we hung up, I sat on my couch for 20 minutes just crying. Daniel came home from work and found me there, mascara streaking my face, and immediately thought something terrible had happened. "She's coming," I told him through my tears. "My mum, she bought a dress. She said she wants to be there." He pulled me close and I felt him exhale against my hair. He didn't say what I knew he was thinking. He didn't remind me about the engagement party or all the other times they'd let me down. He just held me and let me have this moment of hope. The next day, I went back to the bridal boutique. I'd originally chosen an elaborate ball gown with layers of tulle and delicate beading. It was beautiful, dramatic, the kind of dress that made a statement. But standing in the dressing room, looking at myself in all that grandeur, something felt wrong. I asked the consultant to bring me something simpler, something elegant but understated. She came back with a silk sheath dress with cap sleeves and a subtle train. Clean lines, classic cut, nothing flashy. When I put it on, I looked like myself. Just the best version of myself. "This is the one," I said. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing a speech I'd written for the reception. "Thank you, Mum, for being here today. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing to be part of the happiest day of my life." I said it over and over, adjusting the words, trying to get the tone just right. Grateful but not desperate. Loving but not weak. I wanted her to know how much it meant without making her feel guilty for all the times before. In the days that followed, I caught myself daydreaming constantly. I'd be in the middle of a work meeting and suddenly I'd be seeing my father in his Sunday suit offering me his arm. I'd be driving home and I'd imagine my mother sitting in the front row of the church dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as I walked down the aisle. I'd be making dinner and I'd picture the family photos we'd take afterward. All of us together smiling. Proof that I belonged. Proof that they claimed me as theirs. I planned where everyone would sit. My parents and Ethan in the front row on the bride's side, directly across from Daniel's family. I imagined introducing them to people at the reception. "These are my parents." Such simple words. Words I'd never really gotten to say with pride. 22 years I'd been waiting. 22 years since that day on the back porch when my father called me princess and promised to walk me down the aisle. This was it. This was finally it. Daniel was drowning in a major project at work, putting in 12-hour days, coming home exhausted. One night, he collapsed on the couch and said, "I'm so sorry, I'm not more help with the wedding planning right now." I sat beside him, took his hand. "It's okay. As long as you show up on Saturday, that's all that matters." He pulled me close, kissed the top of my head. "Nothing will stop me from standing beside you. Nothing in this world." I believed him. And for the first time in my life, I let myself believe my parents too. "This time is different," I whispered to myself as I lay in bed that night, looking at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door, ethereal and perfect in the moonlight streaming through the window. I can feel it. They're finally choosing me. The rehearsal dinner went smoothly. My parents didn't come to that, but I told myself it was fine. It was just immediate family and wedding party. They'd be at the actual ceremony. That's what mattered. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, Daniel beside me, already snoring softly, and I felt like a child on Christmas Eve. Tomorrow, I'd walk down that aisle and my father would be beside me, and my mother would be watching, and everything would finally make sense. I picked up my phone to set one more alarm just to be safe. The time read 11:47 p.m. As I was putting it back on the nightstand, it buzzed in my hand. A text from Mum. My heart jumped. Maybe she couldn't sleep either. Maybe she was excited too. Maybe she was texting to say she loved me, that she was proud of me, that she couldn't wait for tomorrow. I opened the message. Something came up with Ethan. Emergency. We might not make it tomorrow. Sorry. I read it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. The words didn't change. I sat frozen in my bed phone in my trembling hands, staring at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. The beautiful, simple dress I'd chosen because my mother said she'd be there to see me wear it. The dress seemed to mock me now, ghostly white in the darkness. Beside me, Daniel slept on, peaceful and unaware. And I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at that dress and feel everything inside me start to crack. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, phone clutched in my hand, waiting for another message that never came. At some point, the sky started to lighten. My wedding day had arrived. At 6 a.m, I called my mother. Straight to voicemail, I called my father. Voicemail. I tried Ethan. Voicemail. I sent texts. Please call me. Please, I need to know what's happening. The messages showed as delivered but never read. Daniel found me sitting on the edge of the bed at 7, still in my pajamas, phone in my lap. Hey, he said softly, kneeling in front of me. Maybe they're driving. Maybe their phones are off in the car. You know how your dad is about distracted driving. I looked at him and saw the lie in his eyes even as he said it. He was trying to protect me, trying to give me hope to get through the day. But we both knew. We both knew. I can't do this, I whispered. Yes, you can. He took my hands. You can do this for us. Whatever happens with them, we're still getting married today. You and me. That's what matters. I wanted to believe him. I got in the shower, I put on my makeup. I let my bridesmaid zip me into that beautiful, simple dress. I went through all the motions like a woman underwater, everything muffled and distant. At the church, I stood in the vestibule with my bouquet watching guests file in. Daniel's family filled the right side of the church row after row of smiling faces. His mother, his father, his sisters and their children, his aunts and uncles and cousins. 47 people who'd come to celebrate his happiness. On my side, the first 3 rows sat completely empty. Behind them, scattered across the remaining pews, sat exactly 4 people. My college roommate, 2 colleagues from work, and Aunt Ruth, who kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I heard the whispers, saw people turning to look at those empty rows, then at me, then whispering to their neighbours behind raised hands. The pianist kept playing, filling the awkward silence with increasingly desperate renditions of classical music. My friend Sarah, one of my bridesmaids, squeezed my arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Then, hesitating, she added, "I saw your mum's car at Kroger. About an hour ago, she was buying steaks." The world tilted. Steaks. Not rushing to a hospital. Not dealing with an emergency. Buying steaks at the grocery store while I stood here in my wedding dress waiting for her. The wedding coordinator touched my shoulder. "It's time." There was no father to take my arm. No mother sitting in the front row waiting to see me come down the aisle. I walked alone down that long stretch of white carpet, every step echoing in the too quiet church, every eye on me in my solitary procession. Halfway down, Daniel broke protocol. He left the altar and came to meet me, taking my hand, walking the rest of the way with me. "I've got you," he whispered. The ceremony was beautiful. The pastor spoke about love and commitment and building a family. When it came time for the vows, I looked at Daniel and tried to say the words I'd practiced. But when I got to "for better or worse," my voice broke, tears spilled down my cheeks and I couldn't stop them. Daniel reached up and wiped them away with his thumb. "I'm your family now," he whispered, so quietly only I could hear. "I'm your family." Somehow I got through it. We were pronounced husband and wife. We kissed. People clapped. We walked back down the aisle together, and I smiled and I waved and I played the part of the happy bride. In the church dressing room, I collapsed into a chair while my bridesmaids went ahead to the reception venue. I just needed 5 minutes. 5 minutes to breathe and pull myself together and figure out how to survive the next 4 hours of reception with everyone's pitying eyes on me. That's when I heard it. My phone sitting on the dressing table vibrating. Once, twice, 3 times. Over and over and over. I picked it up with shaking hands. 25 missed calls, all from Mum. And 1 text sent just 2 minutes ago. "Come home, now, emergency." My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. I opened the voicemail, put it on speaker because I couldn't hold it steady enough. The first message, my mother's voice, hysterical sobbing. "Michelle, please pick up. Oh God, please pick up. Something's happened. Please." Second message, "Michelle, where are you? We need you. Please call us back." Third message, my father's voice angry now. "Your brother needs you now. This is serious. Call us immediately." I listened to all 25 messages, one after another. My mother screaming, my father yelling, both of them begging me to come home, telling me it was an emergency, telling me I'd regret it if I didn't come right now. The 24th message was my mother sobbing, "Please, baby, please come home. We need you, please." Then the 25th message, I almost skipped it, was reaching to call them back when I heard it. Silence at first, then clear as day in the background laughter, the clink of glasses, music, upbeat jazz music. And then the line went dead. I stood there in my wedding dress mascara streaking down my face, staring at my phone. Outside, thunder rumbled. Rain had started, heavy drops pelting the stained glass windows. I didn't think. I grabbed my purse, ran out of the church, got in my car. Daniel called after me, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. I had to see. I drove through the pouring rain in my wedding dress windshield wipers, beating frantically, barely able to see the road through my tears and the storm. My phone kept ringing. Daniel. My bridesmaids. I ignored them all. 40 minutes later, I pulled up to my parents' house. Every light it was on. Cars lined the street. I got out of my car, my beautiful dress instantly soaked heavy with rain. My carefully styled hair plastered to my face. My makeup running in dark streams down my cheeks. I walked up the driveway in my ruined wedding dress, toward the sound of laughter, coming from the backyard toward whatever truth was waiting for me there. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The front door was unlocked. I burst through it, rain dripping from my hair, my dress, leaving muddy tracks across the hardwood floor my mother always kept so pristine. "Mom!" I screamed. My voice came out raw, desperate. "Dad! What happened? Where's Ethan?" The house was bright, every light on. Music was playing from somewhere, something jazzy and upbeat. Not the sound of crisis, not the sound of emergency. But I couldn't process that yet. My brain was still caught in panic mode, still convinced someone was hurt or dying, or worse. I ran through the living room, through the kitchen, following the noise. The sliding glass door to the backyard was open, and that's where the laughter was coming from. Louder now, multiple voices. The smell of grilled meat. I stopped in the doorway, frozen. The backyard was full of people. Maybe 15, maybe 20. Neighbours I recognised. Some of Ethan's friends. Paper lanterns strung between the trees, glowing soft and festive in the rain that had started to lighten to a drizzle. A folding table set up with potato salad, coleslaw chips, the kind of spread you'd see at any summer cookout. My mother stood at the grill, spatula in hand, flipping burgers. She was wearing the blue dress. The cornflower blue dress she'd bought for my wedding. Her hair was done, her makeup perfect. My father sat in a lawn chair, beer in hand, telling some story that had 3 of his buddies laughing. He was wearing his good suit, the one he wore to church on Easter. And Ethan. Ethan was right in the centre of it all, surrounded by his friends holding a beer, his face flushed and happy. Behind him on the patio table sat a small cake. Sheet cake from the grocery store, white frosting with blue piping that read, "Congratulations, Ethan. New job. No ambulance, no police cars, no crisis. A party." They were having a party. "Mum!" My voice came out strangled, confused. "What's going on? You said emergency. You called 25 times. You said..." That's when my mother turned around. She looked at me standing there in the doorway, and her eyes travelled slowly from my face down to my feet, taking in the muddy, rain-soaked wedding dress that clung to my body. The mascara I could feel dried in streaks down my cheeks, my hair hanging in wet ropes around my shoulders, my bare feet because I'd kicked off my heels somewhere between the car and the house. Her expression didn't change. No shock, no guilt, no surprise. "Oh," she said flatly, "you came." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My lungs felt like they'd stopped working. She turned back to the grill, flipped another burger. "I wanted to see if you'd come," she said, her voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather. "I wanted to know if you'd choose us over him. And you did." "Gemma." She looked at me again, and something cold flickered in her eyes. "Now you know where you really belong, don't you?" The world tilted. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. "What?" "You left your wedding," she said simply. "Your husband, All those people, you left them all and came here because family comes first, Michelle. That's what I needed to know. That when it really mattered, you'd choose us. I looked at my father. He was watching now, beer halfway to his lips, his face unreadable. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the ground. There's no emergency, I whispered. It wasn't a question. Ethan got a job, my mother said, gesturing at the cake with her spatula. Delivery driver, $15 an hour. It's part-time, but it's something. We're celebrating. $15 an hour. Part-time. They'd made me abandon my wedding reception for a part-time delivery job. You said... I couldn't get the words out. My whole body was shaking. You said emergency. You called 25 times. You were crying, screaming. You said I'd regret it forever if I didn't come. My mother shrugged, like it was nothing. I needed to know you'd come. And you did. You always do. Something inside me broke. Not cracked this time. Broke, shattered completely. My knees gave out. I dropped onto the wet patio stones, my $3,000 wedding dress pooling around me in a sodden, muddy mess. Sobs tore out of my chest, ugly and desperate and beyond my control. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only kneel there in the rain and the mud and feel everything I'd ever believed about my family dissolve into nothing. I heard movement, footsteps, Ethan's voice uncomfortable, awkward. Sis, I'm sorry, I didn't know they'd... But he didn't finish, didn't come closer, just stood there, beer in hand, offering useless words. My father turned back to his friends, picked up his story where he'd left off. His voice carried across the yard. So, anyway, like I was saying, and my mother. My mother set down her spatula, wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked past me into the house. I heard the sliding glass door close. Lock. I was alone in the backyard, kneeling in my ruined wedding dress, sobbing, while my family's party continued around me. The music kept playing. Someone laughed. Someone else asked if the burgers were ready. Rain started falling harder again, soaking through what was left of my dress, mixing with my tears, washing away the last of my mascara. I tasted salt and rain, and something bitter that might have been the end of hope. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours, time stopped meaning anything. Eventually, I heard another car door slam, running footsteps, Daniel's voice breathless and panicked. Michelle, where are you? He found me there, still kneeling on the patio, shaking with cold and shock and grief. He dropped to his knees beside me, tried to pull me up, but I couldn't stand. My legs wouldn't work. What happened? He demanded, looking around at the party at my parents who wouldn't meet his eyes. What the hell happened? But I couldn't answer, couldn't explain, could only let him wrap his jacket around my shoulders and half carry me to his car while my family celebrated behind us and pretended I'd never been there at all. But then, halfway to the car, something inside me caught fire. Not the gentle warmth of hope this time. Something hotter, something that burned away the fog of shock and left behind pure crystalline rage. I stopped walking, pulled away from Daniel's supporting arm. Michelle, he said softly, come on, let's just go home. But I was already turning around, already walking back toward that house, my soaked wedding dress heavy and dragging, leaving a trail of muddy water with every step. It took me 5 minutes to cross that yard again. 5 minutes of forcing my shaking legs to work, forcing air into my lungs, forcing myself to become something other than the sobbing, broken thing I'd been moments before. I walked through the sliding glass door into the kitchen, dripping rainwater and mud onto my mother's clean floor. The party in the backyard had gotten quieter. People were watching through the windows now. My voice came out shaking but cold. Cold in a way I'd never heard myself sound before. You tested me, on my wedding day. My mother was at the sink, rinsing dishes like nothing had happened. She didn't turn around. I needed to know where your priorities were. My father was sitting at the kitchen table now, beer in hand. He finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Family comes first, Michelle. Always has, always will. You chose a stranger over your own blood. We needed to know where your loyalty lies. Something snapped. He's not a stranger, I said, and my voice was rising, now getting louder. He's my husband. I married him 3 hours ago, and he's shown me more love in 2 years than you have in my entire 32 years of life. My father's face hardened. Don't you dare talk to me like that, after everything we've done for you. Put a roof over your head, fed you, clothed you. You did the legal minimum required of parents. I cut him off. You want a medal for not letting your child starve. My mother turned around then, and her face was cold, colder than I'd ever seen it. You've always been ungrateful, always thought you were better than us, better than your brother, better than this family. No, I said, and I was crying again, but I didn't care. I just wanted you to love me. That's all I ever wanted. Just love me, just see me, just once choose me. We did choose you, my mother said. We chose you today. We called you and you came. That's what family does. You lied to me, my voice broke on the words. You made me think someone was dying. You made me abandon my wedding, my husband, everyone who actually showed up for me. For what? To prove you could make me dance like a puppet. My mother stepped forward and her voice dropped low and dangerous. If you walk out that door right now, you are no longer our daughter. We will never speak to you again. Choose carefully, Michelle. The same threat she'd made 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. The sword she'd always held over my head. The thing that had kept me coming back, kept me trying, kept me hoping. But something was different now. Maybe it was the wedding dress ruined and beyond saving. Maybe it was Daniel standing in the doorway behind me, a reminder that I had someone who actually loved me. Maybe it was just that I'd finally broken so completely, there was nothing left to lose. I reached up and unclasped the gold cross necklace from around my neck, the one my mother had given me at my confirmation when I was 16, the one she'd fastened around my neck herself, saying it would protect me and remind me of my faith and family. I walked to the kitchen counter and placed it down gently. I never was your daughter, I said quietly. I was your punching bag. I was the person you took out all your disappointments on. I was convenient to blame and easy to ignore. I turned and walked toward the door where Daniel stood. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, but I didn't look back. Then, I heard footsteps running. Ethan burst through from the living room, reaching for my arm. Michelle, wait. I'm sorry. I swear, I didn't know Mum would do this. I thought they were coming to your wedding. I shoved him. Hard. He stumbled backward, surprise on his face. I'd never raised a hand to him in my life. Had never even raised my voice. You knew, I said, and my voice was shaking with fury now. Maybe you didn't know about today specifically, but you knew. You've always known. You knew they treated me differently. You knew they gave you everything, and me nothing. You knew, and you just took it all anyway because it was easier than standing up for me. I'm sorry, he said again, and he looked like he might cry. I'm sorry. You don't get to be sorry, I said. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally bump into someone. This was 32 years of watching them destroy me and saying nothing, doing nothing. So no, Ethan, I don't accept your sorry. I walked past him, past my mother standing rigid by the sink, past my father still sitting at the table like a king on a throne. Daniel took my hand as I reached the door, and together we walked out of that house. The rain had stopped. The night air was cool and clean. Behind us, I could hear the party starting up again. Someone turned the music louder. In Daniel's car, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, found my mother's contact, deleted it, found my father's, deleted it, blocked both numbers so they couldn't call me back. Daniel slid into the passenger seat watching me. He didn't try to stop me, didn't tell me I might regret it later, just sat there present and solid and real. "What do you need right now?" he asked gently. I stared through the windshield at my parents' house, at the lights blazing in every window, at the shadows of people moving around inside, celebrating, living their lives like I'd never existed. My jaw set, something hard and determined settling into my bones. "I need to know why," I said. "Why she hates me so much, what I did to deserve this," and then I took a deep breath. "Then I'm going to be free." Daniel reached over and took my hand. "Okay," he said simply. "Then let's find out." But 2 weeks later, I still hadn't moved from our couch. I'd called in sick to work on Monday, then Tuesday, then finally sent an email saying I needed personal leave. I didn't know for how long. My boss, who'd been at the wedding, who'd seen those empty rows, simply wrote back, "Take all the time you need." I hadn't showered in 4 days, hadn't changed out of Daniel's old college sweatshirt and a pair of pajama pants. I lay on the couch for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, staring at the ceiling, watching dust motes float through the afternoon light. Daniel would come home from work and find me exactly where he'd left me that morning. Same position, same blank stare. He'd sit beside me without speaking sometimes for an hour. He'd bring me food, I didn't eat water, I didn't drink. Once I heard him crying in the bathroom with the shower running, trying to muffle the sound so I wouldn't hear. But I was too far away to reach him, too far down in some dark place I couldn't climb out of. I wasn't sad, exactly. I was empty, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made me, and left behind just this shell that breathed and blinked but didn't really exist anymore. On the 14th night, I was lying on the couch in the dark when the doorbell rang. It was 11:30. Daniel had gone to bed an hour ago, exhausted from another day of trying to coax me back to life. I didn't move. Whoever it was could go away. But the doorbell rang again, and again. Persistent. I heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, heard him open the door, heard a woman's voice. Aunt Ruth. "I need to see Michelle," she said. Her voice sounded urgent, strained. "I know it's late, but I can't keep this anymore. I can't." Daniel brought her to the living room, turned on a lamp. The sudden light made me wince. Aunt Ruth looked older than I remembered, her face lined with worry. She was soaking wet rain dripping from her coat onto our carpet. In her arms she clutched a cardboard box, the kind that holds copy paper at offices. "Michelle, honey." She sat down on the coffee table in front of me, setting the box beside her. "Your mother doesn't know I have this. I've kept it for 30 years. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But after what happened at your wedding," her voice cracked, "maybe it's time you understood the truth." I didn't respond, didn't move, just stared at her with the same blank expression I'd worn for 2 weeks. She opened the box with shaking hands. The first thing she pulled out was a plane ticket, yellowed with age in a plastic sleeve. She handed it to me. I took it automatically, my fingers moving without conscious thought. One World Airlines, San Francisco International Airport. Departure August 15, 1995. One way. Passenger name Sarah J. Carter. My mother's maiden name. The date meant nothing to me at first. Then I did the math. August 95. I would have been 7 years old. Ethan would have been 3. "Keep looking," Aunt Ruth whispered. The next item was a photograph, also in a protective sleeve. I held it up to the lamplight. My mother, but not my mother. This woman was 25, maybe 26. Her hair was longer, softer around her face. She wore a sundress I'd never seen, something flowing and artistic. And she was laughing. really laughing, her head thrown back, her whole face transformed with joy. Beside her stood a man with kind eyes and dark, curly hair, his arm around her waist, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. I had never seen my mother look like that. Not once in my entire life. The last item was a letter handwritten on lined notebook paper, the ink faded but still legible. My hands were shaking now as I read. James, I can't do it. I can't leave them. But I'll never forgive myself for staying. I'll never forgive myself for not being brave. Sarah. I read it 3 times. 4 times. The words didn't make sense. Who is James? I heard myself ask. My voice sounded rusty, unused. Aunt Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Your mother met him at a community art class. This was before you'd remember. She'd always wanted to paint, always had this creative side your father never understood or appreciated. James taught the class. He was everything your father wasn't. Kind, supportive. He saw her as a person, not just a wife and mother. She paused, wiping her eyes. They fell in love, really in love. James wanted to take her to San Francisco, said she could paint there, said he'd support her while she found herself. They planned everything. She packed bags, hid them in my garage. On August 15th, she drove to the airport. She had that ticket in her hand. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe properly. But she didn't go. Your father called her at the airport. Someone must have told him, or maybe he figured it out. He threatened her. Aunt Ruth's voice turned bitter. He said if she boarded that plane, she'd never see you children again, that he'd declare her an unfit mother, that he'd make sure she lost custody, that he'd poison you against her. She sat at that gate for 2 hours. Then she got back in her car and drove home. I stared at the photo, at my mother's joyful face, at the woman I'd never known existed. She never spoke to James again, Aunt Ruth continued. She burned everything except these 3 things. She gave them to me, made me promise to keep them. And Michelle, her voice dropped to almost a whisper. She's been dying inside every single day since then. Daniel had moved closer, was sitting on the arm of the couch. His hand found my shoulder. I held the photo up again, studying every detail of my mother's face. The genuine happiness, the lightness, the hope. All of it gone before I was old enough to remember. She could have been happy, Jessie, I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. She could have gotten on that plane. She could have been this person. I touched the woman's laughing face in the photograph. But she chose to stay and blame me for her cowardice. Michelle, Aunt Ruth started. No, I cut her off. That's what it was, wasn't it? Every time she looked at me, she saw the reason she stayed, the excuse she used. She could have left. She could have fought for custody. But she didn't. She stayed, and she resented us for it. She resented me. Daniel's hand tightened on my shoulder. What does this mean for you? He asked quietly. I kept staring at that photograph, at the ghost of the mother I never had. Understanding was dawning slowly, painfully, like light breaking through after a long darkness. It means I wasn't her daughter, I whispered. Not really, I was her mirror. Every time she looked at me, she saw the life she gave up, the courage she didn't have, and she hated what she saw. That night I slept for the first time in 2 weeks. Really slept. Not just that shallow, restless dozing I'd been doing on the couch. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window, and Daniel was already gone to work. There was a note on his pillow. I'm so glad you're back. I love you. I showered, put on real clothes, made coffee. At 9 a.m, I called Aunt Ruth. I need to know everything, I said when she answered. Meet me at Bailey's Diner in an hour. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept either. When she saw me, her eyes filled with relief. "You look better," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Tell me about James," I said without preamble. "Tell me all of it." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug like she needed its warmth. "He taught painting at the community centre on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Your mother signed up on a whim. She'd always loved art, but your father thought it was frivolous. Said she needed to focus on being a wife and mother, not waste time on hobbies." I could hear my father's voice saying those exact words, could picture him dismissing anything my mother cared about. "James saw something in her work right away," Aunt Ruth continued. "Said she had real talent, natural ability that could be developed. He told her she could make a living as an artist if she wanted to. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Your father barely glanced at her paintings." "How long were they together?" 6 months. They kept it secret. She'd tell your father she was going to the grocery store or running errands, and she'd meet James instead. They'd go to museums, art galleries, coffee shops, places where they could just talk. He treated her like her thoughts mattered, like she was interesting and intelligent and worth listening to. I felt a pang of something unexpected, almost sympathy. Almost. "James got a job offer at an art school in San Francisco," Aunt Ruth said. "He asked her to come with him, said he'd support her while she painted, that she could take classes at the school, build a portfolio. He found them an apartment with good light for painting. He planned everything." And she agreed. She did. She was terrified but excited. She packed 2 suitcases and hid them in my garage. She wrote goodbye letters to you kids that she never sent. She withdrew $2,000 from a secret account she'd been building for years. Aunt Ruth's voice cracked. She was really going to do it, Michelle. She sat at that gate at the airport for 2 hours. Her flight started boarding. She had her ticket in her hand. I could picture it so clearly. My mother, 25 years old, standing at the edge of her old life and her new one, making the choice that would define everything that came after. What exactly did my father say when he called? Aunt Ruth looked down at her coffee. "He said, 'Sarah, if you abandon your children, I will destroy you. I'll tell everyone you're mentally unstable. I'll get full custody and a restraining order. You'll never see them again. You'll be alone in California with nothing and no one, and I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of mother you are.'" He was very specific, very detailed about how he'd ruin her. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not that I was surprised. I'd seen glimpses of that side of my father my whole life. But hearing it laid out like this, the calculated manipulation, the weaponizing of children. "She walked to a payphone," Aunt Ruth said, "called James and said 3 sentences. 'I can't do this, I'm sorry, don't contact me again.' Then she drove home. She never spoke to him after that, never tried to find him. She closed that door completely. And blamed us for it," I said. "Blamed me for it. Not consciously maybe, but yes." Aunt Ruth reached across the table and took my hand. "Michelle, every time your mother looked at you over the years, she saw the woman she could have been. You were smart, ambitious, brave. You went to college, built a career, moved to the city. And then you met Daniel and fell in love. And when it came time to choose, you chose him. You just chose your own happiness over fear." I felt tears building, but I pushed them back. Not yet. "She hated you for that." Aunt Ruth continued, her own tears falling freely now. "She hated that you had the courage she never did, that you became the woman she was supposed to be. And Ethan," she paused, shaking her head. "She made him weak on purpose, Michelle. She fed him, cleaned for him, made excuses for him, bailed him out of every consequence. She trained him to need her, because as long as he was dependent, she'd never lose him. She'd never be alone with her regrets." The pieces were falling into place. The pattern suddenly clear. Ethan wasn't the favoured child because he was better. He was favoured because he was controllable, because he was safe. And I was punished because I was free. "Does she know you told me?" I asked quietly. No. Aunt Ruth looked frightened. She'd never forgive me. She made me promise to keep those things forever, to never tell you or Ethan. Then why did you... Because what she did to you at your wedding, Aunt Ruth's voice broke, that was too far. That was cruel beyond words. And I realised that keeping her secret was making me complicit in hurting you. I couldn't do it anymore. I sat back in the booth processing everything, understanding at a level I'd never reached before. My mother hadn't hated me because I was deficient. She'd hated me because I wasn't. Michelle, Aunt Ruth said, and something in her voice made me look up. There's something else you need to know. My stomach clenched. What? Your mother was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer 8 months ago, before your engagement. It's very treatable. The doctors gave her an excellent prognosis with chemotherapy and radiation. 8 months ago, when she'd first started getting worse. More critical, more cruel. But, Michelle, Aunt Ruth was crying harder now. She's been skipping her chemotherapy appointments, missing treatments. I found out last week when her oncologist called me listed as her emergency contact. She's not fighting it. I think, her voice dropped to barely a whisper, I think she's giving up. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I sat there in that diner booth, coffee gone cold in front of me, and felt nothing. No rush of sympathy, no urgent need to fix it. Just a strange, hollow acknowledgement that this was who my mother had always been. Someone who chose the path of least resistance, even if that path led to her own destruction. I drove home in silence. Daniel was at work. The house was empty and quiet. I sat down at our kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, and I started to write. 6 hours later, the sun was setting, and my hand was cramping, but I'd filled 4 pages front and back. I read through it once, made a few corrections, then copied it over in my neatest handwriting. Mum, it began, I found the plane ticket. I know about James. I know you wanted to leave Dad, leave us, leave everything behind for a chance at the life you really wanted. I know you went to the airport. I know you sat at that gate with your ticket in your hand. And I know you chose to come back. My hand was steadier than I expected as I wrote. I know you stayed and resented us for it, resented me for it. Every time you looked at me and saw someone who worked hard, who built a career, who chose love over fear, you saw a mirror of your own cowardice. I wasn't your daughter. I was your reminder. The living, breathing evidence of who you could have been if you'd been brave enough to get on that plane. I paused, staring at the words. Then I continued. But here's what you never understood, Mum. I'm not you. When my moment came when I had to choose between staying small and safe or risking everything for love, I chose love. I left that small town. I built my own life. I chose Daniel. And even after everything you did at my wedding, even after you tested me one last time to see if you could still control me, I'm still choosing myself. I'm free now in a way you never allowed yourself to be. The next paragraph was harder to write. You should have gotten on that plane, Mum. Not for us, not for Dad, for you. You should have been brave enough to choose your own happiness. And you should have fought for custody instead of letting Dad's threats control you. But you didn't, and that was your choice. Not mine. Not Ethan's. Yours. I signed it simply, Michelle. Then I went to the copy machine in Daniel's home office and made a photocopy of the picture Aunt Ruth had given me. My mother at 25 laughing with James, radiant with possibility. On the back of the copy, I wrote, "This is who you could have been. I hope seeing her face reminds you what you gave up. Not for us, for control, for fear, for the comfort of playing the martyr instead of living as yourself." Aunt Ruth had given me something else at the diner. A printout of my mother's chemotherapy schedule from the hospital portal she had access to as emergency contact. Appointment after appointment marked no show in red. I folded it carefully and wrote on a sticky note, "Choose life this time," or "Don't. But stop blaming me for your choices." I put everything in an envelope. No return address, just her name and address in my careful handwriting. That evening, I drove to the main post office downtown, the one that stayed open late. I handed the envelope to the clerk, paid for first-class postage, and walked out. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I just felt done. At home, Daniel was making dinner. He looked up when I came in, studying my face. "Did you do it?" "I did. How do you feel?" I thought about it, like I just set down something I've been carrying my whole life. I don't know what happens now, and for the first time in my life, I don't care. I'm not waiting for her approval anymore. I'm not waiting for her to change or see me or love me the way I needed. I'm just done waiting. He pulled me into a hug and I let myself lean into him, into this man who had shown up for me even when my own family wouldn't. 3 days later, I was making lunch when my phone rang. Unknown number. I'd changed my number the day after I mailed the letter, blocking my parents completely. But Aunt Ruth had the new number. She must have given it to my mother. I stared at the screen for 3 rings, then answered, "Hello?" There was breathing on the other end, then my mother's voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. "How?" She sounded like she'd been crying, really crying, not the performative tears she'd used at my wedding. "How did you find out? How long have you known?" I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no desperate need to explain or defend myself. Just a vast, peaceful emptiness where all those feelings used to live. 10 seconds of silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, waiting for my answer, waiting for me to engage, to fight, to care. "Does it matter?" I said finally. Then I ended the call. My phone immediately started ringing again, same unknown number. I declined the call, blocked the number, and went back to making my sandwich. Through the kitchen window, I could see the first flowers of spring starting to bloom in our garden. Daniel and I had planted them together last fall, hopeful for something beautiful to come. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, I was finally free. For 4 months, I lived in that freedom. I saw a therapist every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, a kind woman named Dr. Patterson, who helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just family dysfunction, but systematic emotional abuse. I went back to work full-time, threw myself into projects, closed 3 major deals in 8 weeks. My boss pulled me aside to say she was impressed by my resilience. Daniel and I went on a delayed honeymoon to Maine, stayed in a little bed and breakfast by the ocean, and for 5 whole days I didn't think about my family once. I was healing, actually healing. I'd stopped checking my blocked call list compulsively, stopped jumping every time my phone rang. I was sleeping through the night, laughing again, learning what it felt like to live without that constant weight of disappointing someone. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late June, a certified letter arrived. I had to sign for it. The return address read, Office of the Bankruptcy Trustee, Southern District of Ohio. I opened it at the kitchen table, coffee going cold beside me. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out. Ethan James Carter debtor, and Michelle Ann Carter listed creditor, and total claim debt, $45,000. I was being summoned to bankruptcy court to verify claims that I'd loaned my brother $45,000. I'd never loaned Ethan a dime in my life. My hand shook as I called the number at the bottom of the letter. A court administrator explained in a bored voice that my brother had listed me as a creditor in his bankruptcy filing. I would need to appear in court with documentation proving the debt existed, or file a dispute claiming the debt was fraudulent. "But I never loaned him any money," I said, my voice rising. Then you'll need to file a fraudulent claim dispute, ma'am. The forms are on our website. That afternoon, I was in the middle of a presentation to a potential client worth $3 million when my office phone rang. My assistant knew never to interrupt presentations. I ignored it. 2 minutes later, there was a knock on the conference room door. My assistant stood there, her face pale. Michelle, I'm so sorry. There are police officers here. They need to speak with you. They said it's urgent. The client's eyes widened. I excused myself, my face burning, and found 2 uniformed officers waiting in our lobby. Every head in the office turned to watch as they asked me to step outside. We're investigating a report of stolen property, the older officer said. Your father, Robert Carter, filed a report claiming you took family heirlooms valued at approximately $10,000, a gold watch, your grandmother's engagement ring, and several other items. He says he has documentation proving they belong to him. I didn't take anything, I said. My voice sounded far away. I haven't been to their house in 4 months. I haven't spoken to them. Do you have the items in question in your possession? No. I don't even know what items he's talking about. They took my statement, said they had be in touch, and left. When I went back inside, the client was gone. My boss intercepted me before I reached the conference room. Michelle, what's going on? It's a misunderstanding. Family issue. It will be cleared up. But her expression was concerned, and I saw the question in her eyes that she was too professional to ask. What kind of person gets accused of stealing from their own parents? That evening, I got a call from our biggest client, the account I'd been managing for 3 years. Michelle, we received a concerning email today. Anonymous, but it claimed you're involved in some kind of elder abuse investigation and bankruptcy fraud. I'm sure it's nonsense, but our legal team wants me to ask. I spent an hour on the phone with him explaining, reassuring, feeling my credibility crumble with every word. He said he believed me, but I heard the hesitation in his voice. The next morning, I discovered my mother had created a Facebook account, not under her real name, but Sarah's friend. The profile picture was a stock photo of praying hands. She'd joined every local group connected to our hometown, the church community page, the neighbourhood Watch the Parents Association, for the school Ethan and I had attended 20 years ago. Her posts were everywhere. Heartbroken for Sarah Carter. Her daughter, Michelle, abandoned her while she's battling cancer. Refuses to help her brother, who's struggling. Sarah gave that girl everything, praying for this broken family. The post had 37 comments, all sympathetic, all condemning me. People I'd known my whole life calling me ungrateful, selfish, cruel. I reported the account. Facebook said it didn't violate their community standards. My boss called me into her office. She'd received an email. Concerned citizen warning. It began. Michelle Carter is currently involved in family legal disputes and elder abuse investigation. Thought you should know for your business protection. 3 of our other major clients had received the same message. I need you to take a few days off, my boss said. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Just until this gets sorted out. I believe you, Michelle. But the clients are nervous, and I have a business to protect. I left the office at noon, drove home, in a daze. As I turned onto my street, I saw them. My father and Ethan standing on the public sidewalk in front of my house. Between them, they held a large piece of white cardboard, hand-lettered in thick black marker. Our daughter abandoned her dying mother. 3 of my neighbours stood on their lawn's phones out recording. Mrs. Chen from next door walked over to me as I got out of my car. Michelle, she said carefully, is this true? Your mother has cancer. I stood there in my work clothes, briefcase in hand, staring at my father and brother holding their sign like protesters at a rally. Ethan wouldn't meet my eyes. My father stared at me with something like satisfaction. Get off my property, I said. We're on public property, my father called back. We have a right to be here. We have a right to tell people the truth about what kind of daughter you are. More neighbours were coming out now, watching, recording. whispering to each other. I turned and walked into my house without another word, locked the door behind me and closed all the blinds. Through the window, I could see my father and Ethan still standing there with their sign. They stayed for 3 hours. I know because I watched the clock, unable to do anything else. The next morning, my boss called before I'd even had coffee. "Michelle, I need you to come in. We have a situation." In her office, she looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. "HR received an anonymous tip yesterday. It claims you've been embezzling company funds to pay for legal fees related to your family situation." "That's insane," I said. "That's completely false." "I know, but we have to investigate. It's protocol. I'm putting you on paid administrative leave until this is cleared up. It should only take a couple of weeks." 2 weeks turned into 4. 4 weeks of sitting at home while an auditor went through every expense report I'd filed in 3 years, every client dinner, every business trip. 4 weeks of my reputation being slowly destroyed by an investigation into something I never did. In week 2, a friend from college called. "Hey, I saw something weird on Instagram. There's this account posting about you. I wanted to make sure you knew." The account was called Michelle Carter Truth. The profile picture was a cropped photo of me from my wedding day, my face contorted mid-cry. They'd posted every photo from my wedding they could find. Me walking down the aisle alone. Me crying during my vows. The empty rows on my side of the church. Each photo had a caption. "Smiled for the camera while her mother was dying alone." Chose champagne over chemotherapy. Abandoned her family for a man she barely knew. The account had over 400 followers. Most of them were from my hometown. People were commenting, sharing, adding their own stories about how ungrateful I'd always been. I reported the account. Instagram said it didn't violate their terms of service. Friends started texting, not to support me, but to ask what was going on. "Is your mum really sick? Did you really abandon her?" I stopped answering. Then my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Michelle, this is Karen from Daniel's office. I'm sorry to call, but your mother-in-law just phoned here looking for Daniel. She seemed upset and said it was urgent about you. I thought you should know." My mother wasn't Daniel's mother-in-law. My mother had called Daniel's workplace. When Daniel got home that evening, his face was tight. "We need to talk." "What happened?" He sat down heavily. "Your mother called me today. At work. I don't know how she got my direct line." Ice flooded my veins. "What did she say?" "She said she was worried about you, that you have a history of mental health issues she thinks I should know about, that you were hospitalized when you were 19 for a breakdown." He looked at me, carefully. "Is that true?" "No." My voice came out too loud. "I was never hospitalized. I've never had a breakdown. She's lying, Daniel." "I believe you," he said quickly, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Just a flash, but it was there. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to Daniel. I found him reading it at the kitchen table, his face pale. "What is that?" He handed it to me. It was from my father, typed on official-looking letterhead. He must have made it himself. "Dear Daniel, as Michelle's father, I feel obligated to inform you that our daughter is showing signs of severe psychological distress. We believe she may be experiencing a mental breakdown. Warning signs include paranoid accusations against family members, cutting off all contact with relatives, erratic behaviour, inability to accept responsibility for her actions. We urge you to seek professional help for her before she hurts herself or others. Sincerely, Robert Carter." "They're trying to make you think I'm crazy," I said. "I know," but his voice was uncertain. The next morning, a package arrived. Padded manila envelope, no return address. Daniel opened it before I came downstairs. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of photographs. When he saw me, something in his expression made my stomach drop. "What are those?" He spread them out, photos of me at a coffee shop downtown. with my colleague Marcus from work. We were laughing in one. In another, his hand was on my arm. They looked intimate, suspicious. The kind of photos that told a story even though nothing had happened. "Who took these?" Daniel asked quietly. I picked one up with shaking hands. You could see the date stamp in the corner. Last Tuesday. The day Marcus and I had grabbed coffee to discuss the Miller account. A 30-minute meeting in a public place. "They're following me," I whispered. "They're watching me. They took these to make you think I'm cheating." Daniel's phone buzzed. He looked down and his face changed. "I got the same photos just now." Anonymous email. We stared at each other across the kitchen table, and I saw my family's plan clearly for the first time. They weren't just trying to destroy my reputation. They were trying to destroy my marriage, trying to take away the one person who stood by me. "They're trying to isolate me," I said. "Make everyone think I'm unstable, unfaithful criminal. They're trying to take everything." That afternoon, I called a tech-savvy friend from college who worked in cybersecurity. Within 2 hours, she traced the Instagram account's IP address. It came from the public library in my hometown. She even found the specific computer terminal and the login times. I drove the 2 hours to that library, walked straight to the reference desk. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge." The head librarian was a woman in her 60s who looked at me with recognition. She'd been there since I was a child. "I need to know who's been using Computer Terminal 4 on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the past month." "I can't give out patron information." "Please." Something in my voice must have convinced her. "This is important." She looked at me for a long moment, then pulled up the computer logs. Her finger traced down the screen. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 2 to 4 p.m. Always the same person." She looked up. "Sarah Carter, your mother. She comes in regular as clockwork." Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. The exact times she was supposed to be at chemotherapy. My mother wasn't fighting cancer. She was fighting me. I drove home from that library in a daze, the truths settling into my bones like poison. Every chemotherapy appointment had been a lie. Every sympathetic post about her battle with cancer had been manufactured while she sat at a public computer terminal, methodically destroying my life. 2 weeks later, I was at the grocery store at 10 in the morning, a time I'd started shopping because fewer people were around to stare at me or whisper. I was in the produce section trying to remember if we needed onions when I heard a voice behind me. "Michelle Carter." I turned. Mrs. Chen stood there, the elderly woman who'd lived next door to my parents for as long as I could remember. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair and sharp eyes behind thick glasses. I'd known her my whole childhood. "Mrs. Chen?" I said cautiously. "I need to talk to you." Her voice was urgent. "I've lived next to your parents for 40 years, and I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." We sat in her car in the parking lot. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands even though the engine was off, staring straight ahead like she couldn't look at me while she spoke. "When you were 8 years old," she began, "your mother invited me over for wine one evening. Your father was out of town. She'd had too much to drink and she started talking. She told me she wanted to see if you'd run away like she almost did." My breath caught. "Shan?" "What?" "She said she'd been testing you, leaving you alone in the house for hours at a time, hiding in the garage or upstairs watching from windows to see if you'd try to leave. She wanted to know if you were brave like she wasn't, but you never left. You'd just sit there waiting for her to come back." Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. "She told me Michelle is stronger than I ever was. That makes me so angry." Those were her exact words. I remembered those afternoons, being 7, 8, 9 years old, coming home from school to an empty house, waiting, making myself a sandwich, doing my homework, thinking my mother was just running errands, never once imagining she was there the whole time watching to see if I'd abandoned her the way she'd almost abandoned us. "There's more," Miss Chen said. "When you were 13, you got that scholarship, the one to St. Catherine's Preparatory School. Do you remember?" I did, vaguely. I'd scored in the top percentile on some test. They'd offered me a full scholarship. I'd been so excited. And then my parents said no. "Your mother turned it down," Mrs. Chen said. "She told the school your family couldn't afford transportation, even though the school had offered a free bus that would pick you up at the corner. She told me the real reason over coffee one morning. She said, if Michelle gets too educated, she'll leave us behind. She already thinks she's better than us." My hands were shaking. I pressed them between my knees to make them stop. "She's been clipping your wings your whole life, Michelle. Every opportunity you had, she found a way to cut it down or take credit for it or make you feel guilty about it. She needed you to stay small. Because if you got too big, too successful, too free, you'd be living proof of everything she could have been and wasn't. And Ethan," my voice came out hoarse. Mrs. Chen nodded. "She made him helpless on purpose. I watched her do it. When he was 16, he tried to get a job at the grocery store. She called the manager and said he couldn't take it because he had health issues. He didn't. When he was 20, he wanted to move into an apartment with friends. She had your father co-sign a lease closer to home, then convinced Ethan his friends would abandon him. She fed him, cleaned his room until he was 25, made excuses every time he got fired. She kept him weak and dependent because a weak son would always need his mother. But I was different," I said slowly, understanding dawning. "I wouldn't stay weak." "You terrified her," Mrs. Chen said, and now she did turn to look at me. Her eyes were wet. "Because no matter what she did, she couldn't control you. You got good grades even when she told you school didn't matter. You got jobs and saved money even when she said you should stay home and help with Ethan. You went to college even when she tried to talk you out of it. You built a career, met Daniel, created a whole life that had nothing to do with her, and that was her worst nightmare. Not that you'd leave, but that you'd leave and be happy." I sat there in Mrs. Chen's car, and everything clicked into place. The pattern I'd seen but never fully understood. The deliberate sabotage disguised as concern. The systematic dismantling of my confidence disguised as parental guidance. "Why didn't you ever tell me this, Lois?" I asked. "Why now?" Mrs. Chen was crying openly now. "Because I was afraid of her. Your mother, she has a way of destroying people who cross her. I've seen her do it. To neighbours who disagreed with her. To friends who got too close to you. She'd spread rumours, make accusations, turn people against them. I was a coward, Michelle. I watched her hurt you and I said nothing, because I was afraid." She reached over and gripped my hand. "But I'm 81 years old now. I've got maybe 5 years left if I'm lucky. What can she do to me that matters anymore? And you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know that none of this was ever your fault." My phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but then I saw it was Aunt Ruth. I picked up. "Michelle?" Aunt Ruth's voice was panicked, breathless. "Your mother just collapsed at home. The ambulance is taking her to County General Hospital right now. Your father is demanding you come. He's saying, if you don't come, if something happens to her, it's on you." I closed my eyes. Of course, this was how it would happen. "Are you going?" Mrs. Chen asked after I hung up. I looked at this 81-year-old woman who'd finally found the courage to tell me the truth. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I really don't know." I thanked Mrs. Chen and drove home, my mind spinning with everything she'd told me. The hospital could wait. I needed to think. I needed to process. I needed to figure out if this was real or just another manipulation. But my family wasn't waiting for me to decide. That evening, Daniel came home from work and his phone buzzed with a text. I saw his face change as he read it. Confusion, then something darker. "What is it?" I asked. He showed me. Unknown number. "Your wife isn't who you think. Ask her about the pregnancy she terminated at 20. Ask her why she never told you." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That never happened. Daniel, I was never pregnant. This is a lie." "I know it's probably bullshit," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "But is there anything from your past you haven't told me? Anything at all?" The question felt like a slap. "You're actually asking me this? You think I'd hide something like that from you?" "No, I just..." He ran his hand through his hair. "I don't know what to think anymore, Michelle. Your family keeps saying things and I want to believe you, but what you think I'm a liar now, That's not what I'm saying." But the doubt was there in his eyes. The seed had been planted. We didn't speak much that night. The silence between us felt like a living thing growing and spreading until there was no room left for anything else. The next day, Daniel came home early. I was surprised to see his car in the driveway at 3 p.m. "What are you doing home?" I asked. He looked exhausted. "Your father showed up at my office today." My stomach dropped. "What?" He told the receptionist he was my father-in-law and needed to speak with me urgently. I didn't want to make a scene, so I took him to a conference room. Daniel sat down heavily on the couch. He said he needed to talk to me man to man. That you've always been troubled, that you made questionable choices in your 20s that they had to cover up. He said you have a pattern of cutting people off when they question you, of rewriting history to make yourself the victim. And you believed him? No. But Michelle, he seemed genuinely concerned. He gave me a business card for a family therapist. Said we should go together, that you need help. I snatched the card from Daniel's hand. Dr. Richard Morrison. I googled the name right there. His practice was in my hometown. His profile photo showed him at a church function with my father. "This isn't a real therapist recommendation," I said. "This is my father's friend, someone who will report everything we say back to him." Daniel looked at the photo. I saw something shift in his face. Maybe belief, maybe just more confusion. 2 days later, a letter arrived, addressed to Daniel, not me. I found him reading it at the kitchen table, his face pale. "What now?" My voice came out harder than I intended. He handed it over without speaking. Inside was what looked like official medical records, letterhead from a psychiatric hospital in Cincinnati, dates from when I was 19, diagnosis delusional disorder, treatment inpatient care for 6 weeks. "This is fake," I said immediately. "I was never in a psychiatric hospital. I've never been diagnosed with anything." "I believe you," but his voice shook. "But how do we prove it's fake? These look real, Michelle. They have official stamps and everything." "Call the hospital. They'll tell you I was never a patient there." "What if they can't release that information due to privacy laws? What if I can't prove it one way or the other?" He looked up at me, and I saw real fear in his eyes. "How do I know what's real anymore?" That sentence hung in the air between us. How do I know what's real? This was what they wanted. This exact moment. They were making me look insane so that anything I said could be dismissed as delusion. Classic gaslighting. Isolate the victim, destroy their credibility, make everyone doubt their reality. "You know what's real because you know me," I said. "You've lived with me for 3 years. Have I ever shown signs of delusion? Have I ever lied to you about anything important?" "No," he admitted, "but your family keeps providing evidence, fake evidence, fabricated documents. Anonymous texts from burner phones. My voice was rising. They're making this up, Daniel, all of it, to make you doubt me, to take away the one person I have left. Then why would they do this? His voice rose too. Why would parents go to this much trouble to destroy their own daughter? Because I left. Because I chose myself over their control. Because I'm everything my mother was too afraid to be and she can't stand it. We were shouting now, really shouting, the first time in our entire relationship. I don't know what to believe anymore, Daniel said, and his voice broke. Your family is saying one thing, you're saying another, and I wasn't there for any of it. I don't know what happened in your childhood. I don't know what your relationship with them was really like. How do I know what's real and what's your perception? I stared at him. The man I'd married. The man who'd promised to stand by me. And I saw the doubt winning. You either trust me or you don't, Daniel, I said quietly. Choose. He opened his mouth to respond, but my phone rang, cutting through the tension. I looked down. Dad, calling from a number I hadn't blocked yet. Against my better judgment, I answered. Put it on speaker so Daniel could hear. My father's voice came through grave and urgent. Michelle, your mother may not make it through the night. She's asking for you. If you don't come now, you'll regret it forever. This is your last chance to make peace with her. Don't let her die thinking you hated her. I looked at Daniel, he looked at me. In his eyes, I saw the question, if you don't go and she dies, how will you live with yourself? And underneath that, if you do go, am I losing you to them? I'll be there, I heard myself say. I hung up and grabbed my keys. Michelle, wait. Daniel started. I have to go. I have to end this, one way or another. I walked out the door, leaving my husband standing in our kitchen, surrounded by forged medical records and anonymous accusations, not knowing if I'd come back the same person who left. The drive to the hospital took 45 minutes. I don't remember any of it. I just drove on autopilot, my mind blank with exhaustion and dread. It had been 7 months since my wedding. 7 months of systematic destruction. And now everything was falling apart at once. 3 days ago, my boss had called with the investigation results. You're cleared, Michelle. No evidence of any financial impropriety whatsoever. You can come back to work on Monday. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt nothing. Because that same afternoon, 2 of my biggest clients had sent emails requesting Chinese new account managers. No reflection on your work, they both said, using nearly identical language. Just think, a fresh perspective would be beneficial at this time. The damage was done. My reputation was permanently tarnished, even though I'd been proven innocent. At home, Daniel and I were sleeping in separate rooms. We'd been doing that for 2 weeks now, ever since the fake medical records arrived. We barely spoke. When we did, it was careful, polite like strangers sharing an apartment. The easy intimacy we'd had was gone, replaced by a careful distance that felt like mourning. Now I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot staring at the building. County General, 4th floor, Aunt Ruth had texted. Room 417. I'd been sitting here for 2 hours. It was dark now. I'd watched people come and go, ambulances arrive, lights turn on and off in different windows. But I couldn't make myself get out of the car. My phone rang. Daniel. Where are you? He asked. Hospital parking lot. My voice sounded strange, hollow. Have you gone in? No. Silence. Then, are you okay? The question broke something in me. No, I said and started crying. I'm not okay. They're destroying us, Daniel. They're destroying everything. And I don't know how to stop it. Then let's fight back, he said, and his voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. Together. Come home. We'll figure this out. We'll get a lawyer. We'll document everything. We'll fight back. What if she really is dying? I whispered. What if this is real and I don't go in and she dies thinking I hated her? Do you hate her? I thought about it, really thought about it. No, I said finally. I hate what she did. I hate how she made me feel. But I don't hate her. I mostly just feel sorry for her. Then you don't need to go in there tonight to prove that, Daniel said. You don't owe her a deathbed reconciliation. Come home, Michelle. Please. I wiped my eyes, started the car. I'm coming home. When I walked through our front door an hour later, Daniel was waiting. He pulled me into his arms without a word, and I let myself break down completely. We stood there in our entryway holding each other, and for the first time in months I didn't feel alone. I'm sorry, he said into my hair. I'm sorry I doubted you. I let them get in my head. But I'm done with that. I'm on your side, always. The next morning a package arrived. Express mail signature required. I signed for it, carried it inside, and opened it at the kitchen table while Daniel made coffee. Inside was the original plane tickets. Not the photocopy Aunt Ruth had shown me, but the actual ticket from 1995, yellowed and creased ticket number still visible. And underneath it, a handwritten letter on notebook paper. My mother's handwriting shakier than usual, but recognisable. Michelle, it read. I should have gotten on that plane. I should have been brave like you. Now I'm dying because I'm too much of a coward to even fight the cancer. All those chemotherapy appointments I skipped, all those treatments I refused, they were my choice. My way of giving up. I couldn't stand being the woman who stayed when she should have left. So I chose to stop being anything at all. Live the life I couldn't. Don't let fear win like it won with me. Mum. My hands were shaking. Despite everything, despite all the cruelty and manipulation, this letter hit something deep in me. A recognition of shared pain. An acknowledgement, finally, of the truth. Then I saw there was more in the envelope. Legal documents, official looking with a law firm's letterhead. Last will and testament of Sarah Jean Carter. I pulled them out with trembling hands, skimmed through the legal language, then stopped frozen at the relevant section. I leave my entire estate, including the family home at 428 Maple Street, and all savings and personal property to St. Catherine's Charity for Women in Need. I leave nothing to my daughter, Michelle Ann Carter, who abandoned me in my final days when I needed her most. And below that, a statement meant to be read aloud at the public will, reading, "May God forgive my daughter for choosing her own comfort over her dying mother's needs. I cannot forgive her, but I pray someday she will forgive herself." The documents were signed and notarized, dated 3 days ago, when my mother was conscious and clear-headed, before she collapsed. I read it twice, 3 times. Then I started laughing. The sound that came out of me was harsh, almost hysterical. "Michelle," Daniel's voice was concerned. "What is it?" I handed him the will, watched his face change as he read it. "She sent you that letter," I said, "the one about being brave, about not letting fear win. And, at the same time, she signed a will publicly condemning me. Even in her apology, she's still punishing me. Even dying, she's making sure she gets the last word." Daniel set down the papers. "This is evidence." "Of what? Of a pattern? Of deliberate psychological abuse? Michelle, we document all of this. We get a lawyer. We fight back." He gripped my shoulders. "This isn't just about defending yourself anymore. This is about stopping her from ever doing this to anyone else, including Ethan." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks. Complete, unwavering belief. "You're right," I said, and felt something hard crystallize in my chest. Not anger, something colder. Determination. Let's fight back. But my family didn't give us time to plan. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7 a.m. Aunt Linda, my mother's oldest sister, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Then Uncle Tom. Then my cousin Sarah. Then people whose names I barely remembered, distant relatives I'd seen maybe twice in my life. All of them said the same thing. Your mother is dying. She's asking for you. How can you be so cruel? She's your mother. Get to the hospital now. By noon, I'd received 47 calls and texts. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Daniel finally grabbed it from my hand and turned it off. This is coordinated, he said. Your father contacted everyone. He's trying to overwhelm you. It's working. I felt dizzy sick. What if she really is dying this time? What if I don't go and I miss my last chance? Then we go, Daniel said firmly. But I'm coming with you. And you don't sign anything. You don't agree to anything. And we leave the second it feels wrong. Deal. I nodded, grateful beyond words that he was with me. We drove to County General in silence. In the elevator, up to the 4th floor, Daniel took my hand and squeezed it. Remember, you don't owe them anything, not even forgiveness. Room 417 was at the end of the hallway. As we approached, I could hear voices inside. A lot of voices. Daniel and I exchanged a glance before I pushed open the door. The room was packed. At least 15 people crammed into a space meant for maybe 5 visitors. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. They all turned to look at me as I walked in, and the conversation stopped abruptly. My father stood beside the hospital bed, his hand on the rail. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, then announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Everyone. Michelle has decided to grace us with her presence. Michelle, your mother wants to speak to you before she passes. Every eye in that room was on me, judging, waiting. I felt Daniel's hand on my back steady and warm. I forced myself to look at the bed. My mother lay there and she looked terrible, genuinely terrible. Her skin was grey, her cheeks sunken. An oxygen tube ran under her nose. Her arms were bruised from IV lines. She looked like she was dying. She turned her head slowly toward me and her eyes filled with tears. Michelle, she whispered, her voice so weak I had to lean in to hear. Baby, you came. Her hand reached out trembling. I stood frozen, unable to move toward her or away. Please, she said, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry for everything. For your wedding, for all of it. I was wrong. I just want peace before I go. Please tell me you forgive me. It was a perfect performance. The weak voice, the tears, the trembling hand. Every person in that room was watching me, waiting to see if I'd be cruel enough to deny a dying woman's last request. I started, but my father cut me off. We've prepared something, he said, pulling a clipboard from beside the bed. A family reconciliation statement. If you sign this, agreeing to drop any legal actions, and publicly post that you forgive your mother, we'll withdraw all our complaints and leave you alone. Let your mother die in peace, Michelle. That's all we're asking. He held out the clipboard. The paper on top was titled Family Settlement Agreement. I could see my name already typed in several places, blank lines, waiting for my signature. Just sign it, my cousin Sarah said from behind me. Let her have peace. It's the least you can do, Aunt Linda added. After everything she's done for you. My hand reached out automatically, conditioned by 32 years of compliance. My father handed me a pen. The weight of everyone's expectation pressed down on me like a physical force. I held the pen, my hand shaking, looked down at the document. The print was small, dense legal language. I tried to read it, but the words swam in front of my eyes. Michelle, my mother whispered, please, baby, please. My hand moved toward the paper. I felt like I was underwater, everything moving in slow motion. Daniel had stepped out to take a call, and without him beside me, I felt untethered floating. Just sign it, something in my head said. Just make this stop. Give her what she wants. Let it be over. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Text messages. I pulled it out with my left-hand pen still in my right. 3 texts from Daniel, each one word, stop, don't, sign. Then a longer one. I'm on phone with Aunt Ruth. She says chemo appointments or your mother never stopped treatment. She's been going this whole time. Hospital records show she's completed full treatment protocol. This is staged. Get out now. I read it twice, my brain struggling to process. Then I looked up at my mother, at her frail appearance, at the oxygen tube that I suddenly noticed wasn't actually connected to anything, at the IV in her arm that led to a bag of what looked like saline, but could be anything or nothing. Michelle, my father prompted, just sign it, let your mother rest. I looked down at the clipboard again. This time I actually read the fine print. Words jumped out at me, assumes all financial responsibility, and debts totaling approximately $80,000, and waives right to any future legal action. I was signing away everything, taking on Ethan's bankruptcy debts, taking on my mother's medical bills, agreeing never to sue them for the damage they'd done to my reputation, my career, my life. I looked at my mother, at her perfect dying performance, and I put down the pen. The room went very still. My father's face darkened. My mother's trembling hand froze in midair. Michelle, my father said, his voice taking on an edge. Your mother is dying. Sign the paper. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw what I'd never let myself see before. This wasn't concern. This was control. This was the same threat that he'd used on my mother 30 years ago, repackaged for a new generation. Before I sign anything, I said slowly, let me just check something. I pulled out my phone, opened Facebook, and tapped the live video button. The red recording light appeared. I turned the camera to face the room. Hi everyone, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm Michelle Carter. I'm in hospital room 417 at County General with my mother who claims to be dying. Let me show you what's really happening here. What are you doing? My father demanded, stepping forward. Turn that off. I panned the camera around the room, capturing every face. 15 family members all staring at me in shock. I zoomed in on the clipboard my father was still holding. They're asking me to sign something called a family settlement agreement, I narrated for the camera. They say, if I sign this and publicly forgive my mother, they'll leave me alone. Sounds reasonable, right? Except buried in the fine print, this document makes me financially responsible for $80,000 in debt, my brother's bankruptcy fraud, my mother's medical bills, all of it. This is family business, Aunt Linda said sharply. This is private. Nothing about this has been private, I said, still filming. Let me read you what my mother wrote in her will 3 days ago. I pulled the will from my bag with my free hand and read aloud. I leave nothing to my daughter Michelle, who abandoned me in my final days when I needed her most. May God forgive her, because I cannot. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. I watched the viewer count on my screen climb. 400, 800, 1,500. But here's the thing, I continued. My mother sent me a letter with that will. An apology letter saying she should have been braver, that she was dying because she was too much of a coward to fight the cancer. Except that was a lie, too. I pulled out the printed records Daniel had prepared, held them up to the camera. These are my mother's medical records from County General. She completed her full chemotherapy protocol. 12 appointments, 12 treatments, 100% attendance. She's not dying from untreated cancer. This is a performance. My mother sat up straighter in bed, and I saw several people notice. The oxygen tube that wasn't connected to anything. The way her frail voice suddenly had strength in it when she spoke. "Stop this." My father said, his face red. "Stop this, right now." But I kept filming. I showed them the email my father had sent to my employer. The fake Instagram account registration traced back to my mother at the public library. Ethan's bankruptcy filing listing me as a creditor for debts I never authorised. The forged psychiatric records sent to my husband. 7 months, I said to the camera, my voice shaking now but not stopping. They've spent 7 months trying to destroy my career, my reputation, my marriage, all because I did something my mother never had the courage to do. I chose my own happiness over their control. The viewer count hit 3,000. Comments were flooding in too fast to read. I pulled out one more document, the photocopy of the 1995 plane ticket and my mother's letter to James. I held it up to the camera. 30 years ago, my mother had a chance to leave an unhappy marriage. She had a plane ticket to California, a man who loved her, a chance at the life she wanted. But she was afraid, so she came back, and she's blamed me for her cowardice every day of my life since then. I read the letter aloud. Every word. I can't do it. I can't leave them, but I'll never forgive myself for staying. When I finished, I looked directly into the camera. My mother wrote that she wanted to abandon her family. She stayed not because she loved us, but because she was afraid. And she's punished me every single day since for having the courage she never did. This ends now. I lowered the phone, turned to face my mother. She was sitting fully upright now, no longer performing weakness. Her face was twisted with rage and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You wanted me to break, I said quietly. "You wanted me to come crawling back, to prove I was as weak as you were. But I'm not you, Mum. I'm not afraid of the truth." I walked toward the door. My father grabbed my arm. "You're going to regret this. We'll sue you for slander. I pulled my arm free. "You'll what? Tell more lies. I have evidence of everything. 7 months of harassment, false police reports, forged documents, fake social media accounts. Try it." I turned back to my phone, looked into the camera one more time. If anyone wants to verify what I've shared tonight, all documents will be posted to my Facebook page within the hour. I'm done being silent. I'm done being the villain in their story. Daniel was in the hallway, phone still in his hand. He'd been streaming my live stream, recording everything for backup. He fell into step beside me as we walked toward the elevator. Behind us, I heard my father's voice. "Everyone, I can explain. Michelle is unwell. She's not thinking clearly." But I didn't look back. The elevator doors closed and I checked my phone. 12,000 viewers. 20,000 now. The video was being shared, commented on, spreading through my hometown like wildfire. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You did it!" I leaned against the elevator wall, suddenly exhausted. "I did it." My phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. "I'm watching. I'm so proud of you." Another from my college roommate. "Finally, I always knew something was wrong." Another from a colleague. "We believe you. We've always believed you." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. And for the first time in 7 months, I walked through them free. Daniel drove us home in silence. I kept checking my phone, watching the viewer count climb. 20,000, 30,000, 50,000. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the video had been shared over 2,000 times. I couldn't watch it, couldn't read the comments. I turned off my phone and went to bed at 8 p.m, slept for 14 hours straight, and woke up to a world that had changed overnight. 75,000 views. The local news station had picked it up. I watched the morning broadcast from our living room, coffee growing cold in my hands. As the anchor spoke, a local woman's live stream is going viral after she exposed what she calls years of psychological abuse by her family. Michelle Carter's video has sparked conversations about elder manipulation, family dynamics, and the hidden costs of toxic relationships. We spoke with family law experts who say her documentation of harassment could lead to legal consequences for those involved. They showed clips from my live stream. My mother sitting up in bed, no longer frail. The settlement agreement with its hidden financial traps. My voice steady and clear, reading my mother's cruel will statement aloud. My phone started ringing. I turned it back on an hour ago and it hadn't stopped since. The first call was from my boss. Michelle, I'm calling to formally apologise. HR has reviewed all the evidence you posted last night. We're closing the investigation immediately and issuing a statement that you were the victim of a sustained harassment campaign. You're welcome back anytime. And I have to tell you, 2 of the clients who requested different account managers have already called this morning asking to work with you again. I felt something unknot in my chest. Thank you. One more thing. The client who sent that defamatory email, their legal team contacted us. They're considering a lawsuit against your family for libel. They want to know if you'd be willing to provide testimony. Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes, I would. The second call was from a police detective. Ms. Carter, I'm calling about the theft report your father filed. We've reviewed your live stream and the evidence you provided. We've determined the report was false. Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor. We're issuing a formal warning to Robert Carter and closing the case. If he files any future false reports, he'll face charges. The third call was from a number I didn't recognise. Ms. Carter, this is Thomas Webb, bankruptcy trustee for the Southern District of Ohio. I've reviewed your brother's bankruptcy filing in light of the evidence you made public. The creditor claims appear to be fabricated. I'm referring this case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation of bankruptcy fraud. This is a federal offence. Your brother could be facing 2 to 5 years in prison. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt hollow. Ethan was going to prison. My father was publicly disgraced. My mother was exposed as the manipulator she'd always been. I'd won. So why did I feel like I'd lost something too? That afternoon, Aunt Ruth called. Michelle, I thought you should know. There was an emergency meeting at the church last night. The elders voted unanimously to remove your father from his position as deacon, effective immediately. I closed my eyes. My father had been a deacon for 20 years. It was his entire identity. Your mother discharged herself from the hospital this morning, Aunt Ruth continued, against medical advice. The doctors tried to keep her for observation, but she refused. She went home and locked herself in the bedroom. Won't talk to anyone. Won't eat. Your father is sitting in the living room in shock. He keeps saying, "How did this happen? How did this happen?" And Ethan, gone. His lawyer says he's preparing to take a plea deal on the bankruptcy fraud charges, wants to cooperate with prosecutors. Michelle, your family is falling apart. They did this to themselves, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I know, but it's still hard to watch. For 6 days, I tried to return to normal life. Went back to work, had dinner with Daniel, responded to the hundreds of messages of support. A domestic violence advocacy group asked me to speak at their next event. A journalist wanted to interview me for a piece on family estrangement. I said no to everything. I just wanted to be quiet, to heal, to forget. On the 7th day, my phone rang with a number I recognised. County General Hospital. Ms. Carter. This is Linda Morrison, patient advocate at County General. I'm calling about your mother, Sarah Carter. My stomach dropped. What happened? She was readmitted this morning via ambulance. She's taken an overdose of sleeping pills, approximately 30 Ambien tablets. Paramedics found her in time. She's stable now, medically speaking. But, Ms. Carter, she's asking for you. She says she won't speak to the psychiatric team until she sees you. Will you come? I stood in my kitchen phone pressed to my ear and felt the walls closing Inakin. Again, even now, even after everything. She was still finding ways to pull me back in. Is this real? I asked. Or is this another manipulation? There was a pause. Miss Carter, your mother nearly died. The overdose was genuine. Whether her request to see you is genuine, I can't say. But I can tell you that she's refusing all psychiatric intervention. And without that intervention, we can't safely discharge her. So even her suicide attempt came with conditions. Even dying, she needed an audience. Needed me to be there to witness, to carry the weight of her choices. I'll call you back, I said and hung up. I looked at Daniel, who'd been listening to my half of the conversation. She tried to kill herself. Do you want to go? Did I? I'd just gotten free, just gotten my life back. And now she was pulling me back into the darkness using the ultimate manipulation. Die or watch me die. Choose. I don't know, I said, and I really, truly didn't. In the end, I never had to decide. My mother survived. The initial overdose was stabilised, transferred to the psychiatric ward. But 12 days later, she developed pneumonia. It's common with suicide attempts, the doctor told me over the phone. Aspiration pneumonia from vomiting while unconscious. Her weakened immune system from the chemotherapy couldn't fight it. She died on a Tuesday morning at 6:15 a.m. I was making coffee when Aunt Ruth called with the news. I didn't cry. I just stood there with the phone in my hand watching steam rise from my cup and felt nothing. Daniel asked if I was okay, and I said yes, and I think I meant it. The funeral was small. The church where my father had been deacon for 20 years, where I'd attended Sunday school as a child, where my parents had been married 40 years ago. Only 20 people came. The scandal had seen to that. Most of the town had watched my live stream. Most of the town now knew the truth. I'd spent 3 days writing the eulogy, threw away 7 drafts, finally settled on something honest but not cruel, something true but not vengeful. I stood at the podium, in my black dress, looking out at the nearly empty pews, and began. My mother was complicated, I said, my voice echoed in the quiet church. She loved in the only way she knew how. It wasn't enough, but it was hers. I saw Aunt Ruth dabbing at her eyes, saw Mrs. Chen in the 3rd row nodding slowly. She taught me what I don't want to become, I continued. She taught me that fear is a prison we build for ourselves, that blaming others for our choices is easier than taking responsibility for them, that staying in a life you hate because you're afraid of the unknown is a slow death all its own. I paused. And for those lessons, as painful as they were, I'm grateful. I didn't mention the abuse, didn't list her crimes, didn't air more grievances. The truth was already out there. Everyone knew there was no need to pile on. I hope she found peace, I said finally. The peace she could never find in life. I stepped down. Daniel was there, his hand on my back steady and warm. I leaned into him as we returned to our seat. After the service, people approached me quietly, the few who'd come. Mrs. Henderson, my old art teacher, squeezed my hand and said, I always knew something was wrong. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. A woman I didn't recognize introduced herself as someone who'd known my mother in high school. She was different back then, the woman said. Before she got married, she had dreams. Others just nodded their faces full of apology for years of believing lies. My father sat alone in the back row. He'd aged a decade in 2 months. His face was grey, his shoulders slumped. He didn't speak to anyone. When people started to leave, he stood slowly like his joints hurt and walked toward the exit. Then he stopped, turned, walked directly to me. It was the first time we'd been face to face since the hospital, since my live stream destroyed everything he'd built. He didn't say anything, just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, handed it to me. "From the estate attorney," he said. His voice was hoarse, unused. "Sarah changed her will right before she died." Then he walked away. Didn't wait for a response. Didn't look back. I stood there holding the envelope, unsure what to feel. Aunt Ruth appeared at my elbow. "Michelle, there's something else." She pulled a different envelope from her purse. This one's smaller, more personal. "Your mother wrote you a letter. A private one, not the vengeful one she'd drawn up before. I found it in her nightstand when I was cleaning out her things. She wrote it the day after your live stream." My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. Shaky but unmistakably hers. "I haven't read it," Aunt Ruth said. "It's sealed. It's yours." I took it with numb fingers. 2 envelopes now, 2 final messages from a dead woman who'd spent my whole life sending mixed signals. That night, I sat on our couch with both envelopes on the coffee table in front of me. I'd been staring at them for 3 hours. Daniel had offered to read them for me to spare me whatever poison they might contain, but I'd said no. "You don't have to read them," he said, now sitting beside me. "You can throw them away. You don't owe her anything, even in death." "I know," I said, "but I need to know if she understood. If she finally saw what she'd done, or if she hated me until the very end." I reached for the personal letter first, the one with my name in her handwriting, broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper folded in thirds. I unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was messier than usual, written quickly or with trembling fingers, dated the day after my live stream. "Michelle," it began, "you were right about everything. The plane ticket, James, my cowardice. I made you pay for my failures. I made you carry the weight of every choice I was too afraid to make. I watched your live stream 17 times, watched myself sitting up in that hospital bed caught in the lie, watched you read my cruel words aloud, watched you walk out of that room strong and free, everything I never was." My vision blurred. I blinked, hard, kept reading. "I don't ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I don't even ask for understanding. But you should know this. Watching you walk out of that hospital room, refusing to break, refusing to sign away your freedom for my approval, I was proud. For the first time in your 32 years of life, I looked at you and felt pride instead of resentment. You did what I couldn't. You chose yourself." The next line was crossed out, then rewritten. "It's too late, I know. Too late for apologies to matter. Too late for this letter to change anything. But I wanted you to know you were never the problem, Michelle. I was. I always was. I'm sorry. Mum." I sat there, letter trembling in my hands, and finally cried. Not for her, for the relationship we never had, for the mother she could have been if she'd been braver, for all the years we both lost, to fear and control and manipulation. Daniel pulled me close, and I sobbed into his shoulder while he held me and said nothing because there was nothing to say. My mother was gone. And with her went any chance of the reconciliation I'd secretly desperately wanted my whole life. But in her final words, she'd given me something I'd never had before. The truth. That's what my mother had finally given me in her last letter. But a week later, sitting in an attorney's office for the reading of her will, I braced myself for one more lie, one final manipulation from beyond the grave. The office was small, wood-panelled, smelling of old books and furniture polish. The attorney, a thin man in his 60s, named Mr. Harrison, sat behind a mahogany desk with several folders in front of him. I sat on one side of the desk with Daniel beside me. My father sat on the other side alone. He hadn't looked at me once since we'd arrived. Ethan's chair was empty. He was in county jail awaiting transfer to federal prison. He'd taken a plea deal, 18 months for bankruptcy fraud plus restitution. His attorney had advised him not to contest it. "Thank you both for coming," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his glasses. "I'll begin with the reading of Sarah Jean Carter's last will and testament. This is the revised version dated August 28th. He paused. "That was the day after the incident at the hospital. The day after my live stream. The day my mother wrote me that letter." Mr. Harrison opened the folder and began to read. The legal language washed over me, at first meaningless phrases about sound mind and legal capacity. Then I heard my name. "I leave my entire estate, including the family home at 428 Maple Street, and all remaining assets to my daughter Michelle Ann Carter." Mr. Harrison looked up. "There's a personal note included in the will. Would you like me to read it?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "To Michelle, who was brave enough to tell the truth. Use this to build something better than I did." My father made a sound, almost a gasp, almost a sob. I still didn't look at him. "The estate," Mr. Harrison continued, "after settling all debts and medical expenses, amounts to approximately $40,000, plus the house, which is fully paid off and valued at approximately $220,000. I sat frozen. She'd left me everything. The house I'd grown up in. The house where she'd tested me, manipulated me, made me feel small. She'd left it all to me. "There's more," Mr. Harrison said. He pulled out another document. "Your mother left a separate letter to be read aloud as part of the will. She was very specific about this." He cleared his throat and began reading. "I wrote a different will 3 days before Michelle came to see me in the hospital. That will left everything to charity and included a public statement condemning Michelle for abandoning me. I wrote it to hurt her one last time, to control her even in death. But when she walked into that hospital room and refused to sign my document, when she pulled out her phone and live-streamed the truth to the world, when she walked out of that room with her head high and her spine straight, I finally saw who she really is. She's everything I should have been. She's the woman I killed in '95 when I didn't get on that plane. This is not me asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. This is me acknowledging that she was right about everything." The office was completely silent. Even Mr. Harrison seemed moved, his voice rough, when he continued. "There's one more thing," he said. "Your mother took care of something before she died. She paid off your brother's court-ordered restitution in full. $22,000, the legitimate debts from his fraud case. She did not want his legal troubles to affect you in any way. $22,000. More than half of what she'd had left. She'd spent it protecting me from Ethan's consequences. After that payment and all medical bills," Mr. Harrison said, "the remaining $18,000 in savings is also yours. Your mother left specific instructions. She said, Michelle will know what to do with it. She always has." I couldn't speak, couldn't process. My mother had left me everything, had protected me, had tried in her final days to make something right. Mr. Harrison closed the folder. "Do you have any questions?" I found my voice, though it came out hoarse. "Did she say anything else? Any verbal messages?" He hesitated, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "She came to see me the week before she died. We revised the will, and she was very clear about her wishes. But at the end of our meeting, she asked me to tell you something. She made me write it down to make sure I got it exactly right." He pulled out a small piece of paper from his shirt pocket, unfolded it carefully. She said, "Tell Michelle that the woman in that airport photo, the one smiling with James, that woman died in 1995. She died at that gate when I walked away instead of boarding the plane. Michelle is who she could have been if she'd lived. That's why I couldn't look at her. Because every time I saw Michelle's face, I saw that woman's ghost. And It killed me to know I'd murdered her myself. Something broke open inside me, not cracked this time, shattered. Every wall I'd built, every defense I'd carefully constructed, came tumbling down all at once. I bent forward in my chair and sobbed. Daniel's arms came around me, but I barely felt them. All I could feel was the enormous weight of my mother's words. She hadn't hated me. She'd hated herself. And she'd spent 32 years making me pay for the woman she'd killed inside herself. "I'm sorry," Miss Harrison said quietly. "I debated whether to tell you, but she was very insistent. She said you deserved to know." I couldn't stop crying. Decades of pain poured out of me. For my mother, for that woman in the airport photo who never got to live, for the childhood I'd never had, for the relationship we'd never gotten to repair. My father stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor. I looked up through my tears and saw him standing there, his face grey and old and broken. "She never told me," he said. His voice was hollow. "About James, about the plane ticket, about any of it. I found out from your video. 38 years of marriage and I never knew." Then he walked out, left me there with Daniel and the attorney, and the weight of inheritances, both material and emotional. 8 months later, I'd sold the house on Maple Street. Couldn't keep it. Too many ghosts in those rooms, too many memories of feeling small and unwanted. I used part of the inheritance to pay off our mortgage, put the rest in savings, and tried to build something that felt like peace. I was in my home office on a Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang, with a number I didn't recognise. I almost didn't answer, still wary of unknown callers after everything. But something made me pick up. "Michelle." The voice was hesitant, rough. "It's Ethan." I froze. "Ethan? I know I don't deserve to talk to you. I know I have no right to call, but I wanted you to know I'm out. I got released early 10 months with good behaviour. I'm living in a halfway house on 4th Street. I got a job at a warehouse. 3rd shift loading trucks. And I'm sober. 62 days. So his voice cracked slightly. "I'm trying, Michelle. I'm really trying." I didn't know what to say. Didn't know what I felt. Relief that he was alive. Anger that he thought a phone call could fix anything. Exhaustion at the thought of letting him back into my life. "Why are you telling me this, yo?" I asked finally. "Because you're the only family I have left. Dad moved to Arizona to live with Uncle Bill, won't talk to me, and Mum," he paused, "Mom's gone. You're all I've got, and I know I destroyed that, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to be different." "Good luck, Ethan," I said and meant it. Then I hung up. A week later, the doorbell rang. Daniel answered it, then called up the stairs. "Michelle, someone's here for you." I came downstairs and stopped. Ethan stood on our front porch, not crossing the threshold. He looked different. Thinner, his face gaunt. His hair was buzzed, short prison cut growing out unevenly. He wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, both too big for his frame. "I'm sorry for just showing up," he said quickly. "I won't come in unless you ask me to. I just wanted to give you this." He held out a check. I took it, looked down. $200 made out to me, signed in his handwriting. "First paycheck from the warehouse. Ethan, I don't need... It's not much. It'll take me 15 years to pay back the $45,000 I forged in your name. Probably longer. But this is the start. 200 from every paycheck until it's done. I want you to have it." I looked at the check, then at my brother. Saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hand shook slightly. "Keep it," I said, handing it back. "You need it more than I do." He looked confused. "But I owe you, you do." "But Ethan, I can't have you in my life right now. I'm still healing from everything Mom did. Everything you were part of. I'm not ready." His face fell, but he nodded. "I understand. Can I ask..." He stopped, started again. "Can I try again?" In 6 months, give me time to prove I'm serious about changing, that this isn't just talk. I considered him. This man who'd been complicit in my mother's cruelty, who'd stood by while she destroyed me, who'd sent those anonymous texts to Daniel, who'd held that sign on my lawn, but also this man who'd been made weak and dependent by the same woman who'd resented me for being strong. We'd both been her victims, just in different ways. Come back in 6 months, I said finally. If you're still sober, still working, still in therapy, we'll talk. But I'm not promising anything. And if you slip even once, if you lie to me even once, that's it. I'm done. Do you understand? Yes. His eyes were wet. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. He turned to leave, then stopped. Michelle, I watched your live stream, the one from the hospital. I watched Mum sit up in that bed, watched her face when she realised you weren't going to break. And I thought, that's my sister. That's who she always was. Strong. And I hated that I wasn't strong enough to protect her from Mum, from myself. He walked away before I could respond. I watched him go, this broken man who was trying to put himself back together with no instruction manual and no support system, except his own determination. 6 months passed. I didn't hear from him. Didn't seek him out, just lived. My life went to therapy, worked on my marriage, learned what it meant to exist without constant crisis. Then exactly 6 months to the day, from our last conversation, the doorbell rang. Daniel and I were making dinner together. He went to answer it, then called me. You should see this. Ethan stood on the porch again, but he looked different this time. Still thin, but less gaunt, his eyes clearer, his hands steady, and he was holding several things. He handed me a bronze coin first. I turned it over. 1 year, it read. An AA sobriety chip. Next, a stack of paper. Pay stubs. 6 months worth every 2 weeks from Midwest Logistics Warehouse. Progressive dates, consistent amounts, proof of steady work. Then a letter on professional letterhead. I skimmed it. Dr. Patricia Klein, licensed clinical social worker. To whom it may concern, Ethan Carter has been attending weekly therapy sessions with me for the past 7 months. He has shown consistent commitment to his recovery and personal growth. Finally, he held out something small and green, a potted plant, tiny tomato plant barely 6 inches tall. I grew this from seed, he said. His voice was different too, quieter, more solid. It's the first thing I've ever taken care of that lived. Took me 3 tries. Killed 2 before I figured out how much water they need, how much sun. But this one made it. He looked at me. I'm ready to prove I can do better, Michelle, if you'll let me try. I stood there holding a tomato plant surrounded by evidence of effort and change, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. Someday. Come inside, I said. We sat at the kitchen table, Daniel, Ethan and me. I made coffee. We talked about logistics, not feelings, about what came next. I decided to keep my mother's house after all, not to live in, but to transform it into something different, something better. I wanted to renovate it, maybe rent it out to someone who needed a fresh start, turn that space of pain into a space of possibility. I could use help with the work, I told Ethan, but there are rules, non-negotiable rules. He nodded, waiting. You work 9 to 3 weekdays only. Daniel is always there with you. You don't stay overnight. You don't get a key. I pay you $15 an hour, same as your warehouse job, so you're not losing income. And if you show up drunk, high, or even smelling like alcohol, we're done. Immediately. No second chances. I understand, he said. One more thing. This isn't me saying we're family again. This isn't reconciliation. This is me offering you an opportunity to prove you've changed. That's all it is. That's all I'm asking for, he said quietly. The next Monday, Ethan showed up at the Maple Street house at 9 a.m. sharp. Daniel was already there, having opened up the windows to air out the rooms that had been closed for months. I arrived 10 minutes later with painting supplies, work gloves, and a thermos of coffee. We didn't talk much that first day. Just worked. Ethan stripped old wallpaper in the hallway while I painted the living room a warm cream colour covering the dark panelling my mother had insisted on keeping for 40 years. Daniel replaced rotten boards on the back porch. The only words exchanged were functional. Hand me that scraper. Is there more paint in the truck? Want it to break for lunch? It was easier that way, building trust through actions instead of words, letting the work speak for itself. The second week, Ethan asked, "Want coffee?" when he arrived with a thermos of his own. I said yes. By the third week, we'd fallen into a rhythm. He'd arrive, we'd review what needed doing that day, then work in companionable silence, occasionally asking each other for tools or opinions on paint colours. One afternoon, Daniel pulled me aside while Ethan was out back, pulling weeds from the overgrown garden. "Do you trust him?" he asked. I thought about it, really thought about it. "Not yet," I said honestly. "Maybe not ever fully, but I trust myself to keep boundaries. And he seems to be trying. That's all I can ask for right now. I can't control whether he stays sober or keeps showing up or actually changes. I can only control how I respond. And I'm choosing to give him this chance while protecting myself." Daniel kissed my forehead. "You're stronger than you know." "I learnt it the hard way," I said. 4 weeks into the project, the house was starting to look different. Lighter. The walls were painted in soft, welcoming colours. The floors had been refinished. New curtains hung in the windows, letting in sunlight that had been blocked for decades. It was becoming something new. Ethan was putting tools away in the garage one afternoon when he stopped and turned to look at me. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why are you doing this, giving me a chance after everything I did, everything I was part of? I don't understand why you'd let me anywhere near you." I set down the paintbrush I'd been cleaning and looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw my little brother, the one who'd been shaped by the same woman who'd shaped me just in a different way. Both of us damaged. Both of us trying to find our way out of the wreckage. "I'm not doing it for you, Ethan," I said. "I'm doing it for me, to prove to myself that I can be better than she was, that I can offer grace without being a victim again, that I can extend a hand without losing myself in the process. Mum never learned how to do that. She thought love meant control, that family meant obligation, that forgiveness meant erasing boundaries. I'm learning something different." He was quiet for a long moment. "What's that?" "That being strong enough to walk away and being strong enough to let someone try again aren't opposites. They're both forms of strength. I was strong enough to cut you all off when I needed to. Now I'm strong enough to let you prove you've changed. But make no mistake, if you fuck this up, I'll walk away again, and I won't look back." "I won't fuck it up," he said. "We'll see." I said, not unkindly, just honestly. The next week, I was working in the backyard planting tomatoes in the garden Ethan had cleared. We'd decided to put in raised beds, grow vegetables, make the space productive instead of just decorative. I was on my knees in the dirt, hands deep in soil, when I heard a small voice. "What are you planting?" I looked up. A little girl stood on the other side of the fence, peering through the slats. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, thin arms, a t-shirt that might have been white once but was now grey. She lived in the house next door, the one that always had the blinds closed, the yard overgrown, the paint peeling. "Tomatoes?" I said, smiling. "Want to help?" She looked back over her shoulder at her house nervously. "I'm not supposed to talk to people." "That's a good rule," I said. "Strangers can be dangerous, but I'm not a stranger. I'm your neighbour. My name's Michelle. What's yours?" She hesitated. Lily. It's nice to meet you, Lily. These tomato plants need someone to help water them. Think you could do that? She started to answer, but her stomach growled, loudly. She pressed her hand to her belly, embarrassed. Are you hungry? I asked gently. She looked down, didn't answer. But I saw her nod just barely. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my jeans. I have sandwiches inside. Turkey and cheese. You want one? I should probably go home, she said, but she didn't move. The sandwiches will be here if you change your mind, I said. And Lily, you can come talk to me anytime, okay? Anytime you need anything. She looked at me with eyes too old for her face, then disappeared back into her yard. I heard a door slam, saw a curtain twitch in the window. I stood there in my mother's garden, hands covered in soil, and felt something shift. A recognition, a calling, this little girl with her thin arms and nervous eyes and growling stomach. I'd seen her before, 25 years ago in a mirror. That image haunted me for the rest of the day. That night, I told Daniel about Lily, about the hungry look in her eyes, about the way she'd glance back at her house like a prisoner, checking for guards. We should keep an eye out for her, he said. Maybe invite her over again. The next afternoon, I was in the garden again, and Lily appeared at the fence. Can I still help with the tomatoes? She asked quietly. Of course, I said. Come on over. She slipped through a gap in the fence I hadn't noticed before. Up close, I could see more details I'd missed. Her clothes weren't just dirty, they were too small, her wrists showing past the sleeves. Her hair needed washing. She had a bruise on her shin, yellowish green, like it was a week old. We worked in the garden for an hour. I asked her about school. She was in 5th grade. Her favourite subject was art. She liked drawing animals. When I asked if she wanted a snack, her face lit up like I'd offered her treasure. Inside, I made her a sandwich and cut up an apple. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days, which maybe she hadn't. I didn't comment on it, just quietly made her another sandwich when she finished the first. What's your mum's name? I asked casually. Jennifer, but she doesn't like when people come over. She's tired a lot. She has a boyfriend, but he's not there much. The words came out practiced like she'd said them before. Over the next 2 weeks, Lily came over every day after school, always through the gap in the fence, always hungry. I learned her mother worked sporadically at a gas station, but mostly stayed home. The boyfriend, when he was around, had a temper. Lily had learned to be very quiet. Sometimes her mother forgot to go grocery shopping for days at a time. Sometimes Lily went to school on just what they gave her for breakfast and lunch. I started teaching her to cook simple things: scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, mac and cheese from a box, skills she could use at home when there was food. Daniel would come home and find us at the kitchen table, Lily doing homework while I made dinner. He'd join us, help her with math problems, tell terrible dad jokes that made her giggle. Ethan was there one afternoon taking a break from painting. I'd started letting him come inside the main house during work hours, a sign of growing trust. He saw Lily struggling with the old guitar I'd found in the garage. I can show you, he said, if you want. She looked at me. I nodded, and for the next 20 minutes I watched my brother gently teach this little girl how to hold the guitar, where to put her fingers. His hands were steady. His voice was passionate. I saw a glimpse of the person he might have been if our mother hadn't broken him. One evening, Lily said something that made me put down the dish I was washing. My mum forgets to buy food sometimes. She says she's going to, but then she doesn't. I get really hungry. How often does she forget? Daniel asked gently. Lily shrugged. Lots. Sometimes I just eat ketchup packets from school. That night, Daniel and I lay in bed and had the conversation I'd been avoiding. We have to call someone, he said. I know. She needs more than sandwiches and guitar lessons. She needs safety, consistent food, adults who remember she exists. I know, I said again. And I did. I'd known from the first day, but calling Child Protective Services felt like crossing a line. like becoming responsible for whatever happened next. "We're already responsible," Daniel said, reading my mind. "We know she's not safe. If we don't report it and something happens to her, we'll carry that forever." The next morning, I made the call. A caseworker named Patricia came out 3 days later. I saw her knock on Lily's door, saw the curtains twitch, but nobody answer. She left a card and came back the next day with a police officer. This time, the door opened. Lily didn't come to the fence after that. For 5 days, I didn't see her at all. I stood in the garden and stared at that gap in the fence and wondered if I'd done the right thing or just made everything worse. Then Patricia called. "We've removed Lily temporarily. Emergency placement. Her mother failed a drug test. The boyfriend has an outstanding warrant. The house was deemed unsafe. Lily is in a temporary foster home while we assess the situation." My throat tightened. "Is she okay?" "She keeps asking for you. She says you're her friend." Daniel and I looked at each other across the kitchen table. "What do we do?" I asked. "We could become certified foster parents," he said. "It's a 3-month process. Training, background checks, home study. If we started now, if Lily's case goes the way these cases usually go, we might be approved by the time she needs placement." "That's a big if, a big commitment." "I know," he said. "But Michelle, I've watched you with her. I've watched you teach her to cook, help with homework, make her feel safe. You're already doing it. We're just making it official." We started the certification process the next week. 12 weeks of training every Saturday. Background checks that went back a decade. Home studies where a social worker examined every room, asked about our marriage, our finances, our childhoods. I had to talk about my mother, about the abuse, about the live stream. The social worker took notes and said, "That makes you more qualified, not less. You know what neglect looks like. You know how it damages. You'll see the signs other foster parents might miss." During week 8 of training, Patricia arranged for me to visit Lily. She was in a foster home across town, staying with an older couple who had 3 other foster kids. The house was clean, organised, fine, but Lily looked smaller somehow, folded in on herself. When she saw me, she ran over and hugged me around the waist. "I thought you forgot about me," she said into my shirt. I knelt down, held both her hands. "Why would you think that? Because nobody ever remembers me." "Lily, I need to ask you something. Why are you being nice to me? A lot of kids would be mad at me for calling CPS." She looked confused. "You made sure I was safe. Nobody ever does that. Nobody is ever nice to me." I felt tears building but pushed them back. When I was growing up, I needed someone to be kind to me too, and they weren't. "I can't fix my past, Lily, but I can make sure you're safe now. That's why I called. Not to hurt you, to protect you." She hugged me again, tighter this time. 3 weeks later, during week 11 of our certification, Patricia called. Lily's mother signed over voluntary termination of parental rights. She entered a treatment program but acknowledged she can't care for Lily right now. Maybe not ever. "We need to place Lily somewhere permanent, and she asked for you specifically, Michelle. She calls you Aunt Michelle to everyone here. She wants to know if she can live with you." I sat down hard in my chair, phone pressed to my ear. "We're not certified yet. We have 1 more week." "I know, but I can expedite the final approval if you're interested. So, I need to know. Will you take her?" I looked at Daniel. He was already nodding, tears in his eyes. "Yes, I said, my voice breaking. "Yes, we will." 2 weeks later, Lily moved into our guest bedroom with a donated dresser, fresh paint on the walls in softened lavender, and a shelf Daniel had built for her books. She owned 1 backpack of clothes, a stuffed rabbit with a torn ear, and a composition notebook full of drawings. That was everything. The first official dinner with Lily, living in our home, I kept it simple. Spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread salad. Nothing fancy, nothing that could go wrong. I'd invited Ethan and he'd accepted nervously, unsure of his place in this new configuration. We sat around the table, the four of us. I watched Lily's eyes dart between faces, still uncertain, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to end. "Is Ethan your brother?" she asked, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "Yes," I said. "We're learning to be family again. It's complicated." "Why?" "Because we hurt each other, and now we're trying to do better. Sometimes family is about choosing to try again, even when it's hard." Ethan had brought something with him, a small gift bag that he set beside Lily's plate. She looked at it suspiciously, like it might contain something dangerous. "It's for you," he said, "for your new room." She opened it slowly. Inside was a colouring book, the nice kind with thick pages and intricate designs and a set of good coloured pencils, not crayons, the expensive pencils that artists use. "For me?" Her voice was small. "Yeah, Michelle said you like to draw. I thought maybe you'd like these." "Thank you," she whispered. Then, louder, "Thank you, Uncle Ethan." I saw him blink hard, surprised by the title, by the easy way she'd claimed him as family. After dinner, he pulled out his guitar, without being asked, and played softly while we cleaned up. Nothing complicated, just gentle melodies that filled the spaces between conversations. Lily hummed along, then started singing made-up words, then dissolved into giggles at her own silliness. Real laughter, genuine child laughter, the kind that comes from feeling safe enough to be ridiculous. I stood at the sink, washing dishes, and felt something tight in my chest loosen. This was what a home was supposed to sound like. Later, after Lily had gone upstairs to colour in her new book, Ethan helped me put away the last of the dishes. He was quiet for a long time, then said, "Mum would have hated this." "I know. She would have hated seeing you happy, hated seeing me trying, hated that little girl feeling safe here when we never did." "I know," I said again. "That's exactly why it's perfect," I continued. "We're breaking the cycle. We're building something she couldn't destroy because she's not here anymore." "This is ours, Ethan. This family we're building, it's ours." He nodded, but I could see a question forming. He opened his mouth closed. It tried again. "Do you think she'd be proud if she could see us now? See us trying to be better?" I could have lied, could have offered him the comfort of thinking our mother would approve from wherever she was. But I'd spent too many years lying to myself about who she was. "No," I said honestly. "I don't think so. I think she'd find some way to criticize it, to make it about her pain, to poison it somehow. But, Ethan, I'm proud of us. I'm proud that you're still sober, still working, still showing up. I'm proud that I'm strong enough to offer that little girl safety. I'm proud that Daniel and I built a marriage solid enough to handle this. And that's enough. It has to be enough." "So, May?" He smiled, small but real. Yeah, it is." That night, after Ethan left and Daniel was in the shower, Lily came downstairs in her new pajamas. She held out a piece of paper folded in half. "I made this for you," she said. I unfolded it. A drawing in coloured pencil, 4 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Each figure was labelled in careful child handwriting. Aunt Michelle, Uncle Daniel, Uncle Ethan, me. Above them, in bigger letters, my real family. My throat closed. I knelt down to her level. "This is beautiful, Lily. Can I keep it?" "I made it for you, so you can remember." "Remember what?" "That I love you, that you're my family now." I hugged her, this small girl who'd been taught that love was unreliable, that adults forgot about you, that family meant hunger and fear. "You're my family too," I said, "and I'm not going anywhere, I promise." After I tucked her into bed, I went downstairs and taped her drawing to the refrigerator with 2 magnets, right in the centre at eye level, exactly where my mother used to hang photos of Ethan's mediocre achievements, while my straight A report cards went in a drawer. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen sink washing breakfast dishes and looked out the window. Lily and Ethan were in the backyard planting flowers in the garden bed we'd prepared together. She was asking him questions about each plant, and he was answering patiently, showing her how to dig the holes, how much water each one needed. She said something I couldn't hear through the window, and he laughed. Threw his head back and laughed, genuine and unguarded. I realised it was the first time I'd ever seen my brother smile like that. Really smile, not the careful fake smile he'd learnt to use to deflect our mother's moods. Daniel came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, rested his chin on my shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You broke free." I leaned back into him, watched Lily carefully pat dirt around a marigold, watched Ethan hand her the watering can. "We all did," I said. "We're all healing." "Do you think it'll last with Ethan?" "I don't know." I said honestly. Recovery isn't linear. He might relapse, he might disappear, but right now, in this moment, he's here. He's trying, and that's all I can ask for. Through the window, Lily jumped up and hugged Ethan around the waist. He froze for a second, surprised, then hugged her back. Awkward, but genuine. "She's going to be okay," Daniel said. "You're giving her what you never had." "We're giving her what we never had," I corrected. "You mean even Ethan in his own way?" "We're all teaching her no, that family doesn't have to mean pain. That love doesn't have to come with conditions. That she's safe to be exactly who she is." I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked around our kitchen, at Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, at the tomato plant Ethan had given me, now thriving on the windowsill, at Daniel's coffee mug on the counter, at all the small, ordinary pieces of a life built on choice instead of obligation. My mother had tried to break me, had tried to make me small and scared and dependent, had tried to punish me for having the courage she'd lacked. But I was standing in my own kitchen, in my own home with a family I'd chosen, and who'd chosen me back. I was fostering a child who needed safety. I was building a relationship with my brother that was based on boundaries and effort instead of obligation and resentment. I was married to a man who saw me, really saw me, and loved me anyway. I had broken free. And in breaking free, I'd learnt something. My mother never understood healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means building something so strong, so full of light that the shadows can't reach it anymore. Outside, Lily laughed again, the sound floating through the open window like a promise. We were all healing. And that was more than enough. But healing, I learned over the year that followed, isn't a destination you reach and then stop. It's a practice. A choice you make every morning when you open your eyes. 1 year later, 30 months from the day I walked down that aisle alone, I sat on the front porch of my mother's old house. My house now. The renovation was complete, and it bore no resemblance to the dark, closed-off space where I'd grown up. The walls were painted in warm creams and soft yellows. Light poured through windows that were no longer covered by heavy drapes. The garden I'd planted with Lily bloomed with tomatoes, herbs, and bright marigolds that turned their faces toward the sun. In the driveway, Lily played basketball with Daniel, her laughter ringing out clear and unguarded. She was 11 now, taller, stronger, her thin arms filling out with the steady nourishment of 3 meals a day and a home where she was safe. Sometimes she called me Mum by accident, and every time she did, something in my chest both broke and mended simultaneously. A truck pulled up to the curb and Ethan climbed out. 18 months sober. He'd been promoted to assistant warehouse manager, had his own apartment, now paid his bills on time, showed up when he said he would. He came for a Sunday dinner every week, a ritual none of us wanted to break. "Ready for that guitar lesson, Lily?" he called. She dropped the basketball and ran to hug him. "I've been practicing all week." I had an old photo album open in my lap one I'd found while cleaning out the attic months ago. I'd been avoiding it, but today felt right. I flipped through the pages slowly. Birthday parties where Ethan was always at the centre. Christmas mornings with uneven piles of gifts. School photos where my mother had written only the year, never my accomplishments. Then I found the wedding photo. Someone had taken it from the back of the church. You could see everything. Daniel's side filled with people who'd shown up for him. My side, those 3 empty rows, like a wound that wouldn't close. I touched the photo gently. The hurt was still there, would probably always be there, but it was duller now, an old ache instead of a fresh agony. "I wish you could have been different, Mum," I whispered to the image. I wish I could have known the woman in that airport photo. The one who laughed, the one who had dreams before fear killed them. Daniel came up the porch steps and sat beside me. He glanced at the album at that wedding photo with its empty rows and took my hand without a word. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Cutting them off?" "Everything that happened." I thought about it carefully. The question deserved an honest answer, not an easy one. "I don't regret choosing myself," I said, "but I regret needing to. I wish they'd been capable of loving me the way I needed to be loved. I wish my mother had been healthy enough to celebrate my happiness instead of punishing me for it. But they weren't capable, and that's not my fault. It never was." Lily bounded up the porch steps, breathless and happy. "Aunt Michelle, Uncle Ethan says he'll teach me that new song tonight. Can we please?" I smiled, closed the album, and set it aside. "Of course, sweetheart. Go get the guitar from the house." She disappeared inside her footsteps, echoing through rooms that now held laughter instead of silence. People ask me sometimes if I forgive my family. I tell them the truth. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. You flip once and you're done. It's a door you have to choose to walk through every single day. Some days I walk through easily. Some days I stand at the threshold and cry for what I never had and never will. But I keep choosing to walk forward. Because freedom isn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let the past decide your future. My mother stood outside that door for 30 years, blaming everyone else for locking it. She could have walked through at any time, but fear is a powerful prison, and she chose to stay locked inside it. I walked through, and on the other side, I found something she never had myself. The real me, unfiltered and unafraid. And that is enough. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Through the open window drifted the sound of Lily's tentative guitar chords, mixed with Ethan's patient encouragement. His laugh when she hit a wrong note, her giggle in response. Daniel had started the small grill in the backyard, the smell of burgers cooking floating over the porch. Once that smell would have broken me, would have dragged me back to my wedding day, and the party my parents threw instead of attending my ceremony. Now it just smelled like Sunday dinner, like home. I stood and walked down to the mailbox, just the ordinary ritual of checking for bills. Inside was a manila envelope forwarded from my mother's old address. I opened it carefully. The plane ticket, the original from 1995 preserved in plastic, and a short note on lined paper. I saw the news about Sarah. "I'm sorry, she was supposed to use this ticket. I held on to it for 30 years hoping she'd come back for it. I think she'd want you to have it. She was brave in the end, even if it took a lifetime. Best wishes, James." I stood there holding the ticket, this artifact of a life unlived, and whispered, "She got on the plane after all, just not the way she thought." I walked back to the porch, opened the album, and slipped the ticket in next to the wedding photo. The empty rows and the unused ticket side by side. Both symbols of my mother's fear. Both part of the story, but no longer the whole story. I closed the album. From inside the house, Lily's guitar rang out clearer now, finding the melody. Ethan's voice joined hers in song. Daniel called that dinner was ready. The wind chimes I'd hung by the door sang softly in the evening breeze. I stood on the porch of the home I'd reclaimed and rebuilt, surrounded by the family I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back, and felt something settle deep in my chest. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. I whispered to the wind, to the setting sun, to the woman I used to be and the woman I'd become. I'm home. Thank you so much for staying with Michelle through this entire journey. From that devastating wedding day with 3 empty rows, through 7 months of systematic destruction, to finally finding freedom and building the family she deserved. This wasn't just a story about cutting off toxic family members. It was about something deeper, learning that you can't pour from an empty cup, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who will never see your worth. Michelle's mother spent 30 years standing at the door of freedom, blaming everyone else for locking it when she held the key all along. But Michelle walked through that door. She chose courage over guilt boundaries, over obligation, and built something beautiful on the other side. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Do you think Michelle made the right choices, or should she have tried harder to reconcile? What would you have done in her situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your stories and perspectives make this community what it is. And if this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear that, it's okay to choose themselves. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these deeply human stories we share every week. Share this video with someone who might need to hear Michelle's message. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is give ourselves permission to be free. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about refusing to let the past decide your future. I'll see you in the next story.